CD 7. Clearing of the scorched site of the fire was already well underway. Wilfrid had retained an architect and a builder, both briefed to restore Oakley as soon as possible. Edna Walling and her crew had also returned, and their work in the gardens was proceeding with a renewed vigour. As Arthur Sinclair had now spoken with Colonel Bennett and obtained his blessing, Lucy remained in Sydney to celebrate the good news with her family. She did, however, promise Kate and her fiancé that she would visit Oakley again as soon as she was able. Detectives Gilby and Angel called by the day the family arrived back to check that Roland was indeed complying with the condition of his bail, which stipulated that he live with Wilfrid Sinclair. Roland's passport had been surrendered to the court, but it was understood that men of Wilfrid Sinclair's means and influence could obtain whatever paperwork they needed and afford to lose the financial surety put up for bail. Kent, Beswick and Associates also called to discuss strategy and update their clients. In a dramatic demonstration of confidence in his brother's innocence, Wilfrid Sinclair offered a 10,000 guinea reward for anyone who provided the police with information leading to the apprehension and conviction of Henry Sinclair's murderer. The move had perplexed Roland at first, until Delaney telephoned to report that the Criminal Investigation Bureau was being inundated with calls, letters, telegrams, and witnesses, all claiming to know who killed Henry Sinclair. "We had a bloke in here yesterday, dabbing in his mother for doing away with your old man," the friendly detective said, laughing. "Gilby and Angel will be working around the clock for months to follow up this lot." Alice Kendall welcomed Roland back with joy and tears and apology. He was forced to eat close upon an entire batch of her shortbread before she would believe that it was not anything she had said which led to his arrest. "You know I didn't shoot Father, don't you, Mrs. Kendall?" he asked when he'd finally calmed her. The old housekeeper clasped her hands to her heart.
"It's so good to hear you say that," she gasped. "I always knew it in my soul, but sometimes I wondered."
She broke down again.
"He could be such a cruel man. I wish I could have done more for you."
Roland took her hand. "I know, Mrs. Kendall. I knew then, too."
"I wanted to say something, but if he'd sacked me, you would have had no one at all. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you with that man."
"I know," he said, rubbing her hand. "I'm glad you didn't give him an excuse to take you away too." He waited until she'd blown her nose. "Do you remember anything at all about that night? Could anyone else have been in the house?"
"Oh, Mr. Roland," she said,
dabbing her eyes with the edge of her apron.
"You know the kitchen door is always left open. It was then, too. We kept a bigger staff in those days, people always coming and going. And then there were the gentlemen who came to see Mr. Sinclair."
"Will?"
No, your father."
"Who?"
"The accountants, the solicitors."
The housekeeper's whole face furrowed as she tried to remember.
"As for the rest, I'm sure I don't know."
Roland asked one more thing. "The guns, Mrs. Kendall, they used to be kept in the cupboard next to your pantry. Do you know if they were all accounted for after he died?" Mrs. Kendall smiled.
"Your father was not as particular or careful as your brother about the guns. There were several missing the night he died. Mr. Sinclair was always taking them out for some reason or another and then forgetting to put them back. The maids would regularly find loaded pistols about the place."
She clicked her tongue disapprovingly.
"It's only since he died that there's even been a lock on the cupboard."
"So anyone may have taken one?"
"Anyone who knew where they were kept, or I suppose anyone who found one Mr. Sinclair had left about."
"And the gun Miss Walling found in the dam? Do you remember when you last saw it in the cupboard?"
"I'm so sorry. I'm so useless."
The old woman fretted now.
"Until Mr. Sinclair was shot, we didn't really pay any mind to what was or was not in the gun cupboard."
Roland dusted the shortbread crumbs from his tie. "That's probably as it should be, Mrs. Kendall." Edna joined Milton and Clyde at the Mercedes. Clyde was bent under the bonnet, checking oil or some such thing. He and Milton were deep in conversation. Edna caught the end of it. "Why else would he tell Rowley he was sorry? Wilfrid wasn't talking about shooting Henry Sinclair, Edna said. You know that. We weren't talking about Wilfrid, Clyde said. We were talking about Harry Simpson. Harry? He told Rowley he was sorry just before the police took us away, Milton said, frowning. It got me thinking. That's ridiculous. Why would Harry kill Henry Sinclair? Maybe he wanted Wilfrid in charge. Why? Wilfrid made Harry manager, Milton reminded her. Don't be idiotic, Milt. Harry doesn't care about that sort of thing, Edna replied, cross. It was 13 years ago, Ed. Perhaps Harry was different back then, Clyde ventured, though clearly the idea did not sit well. He liked the stockman, but still. You know, when Rowley first told him that his father's gun had been found, Harry asked how. Not where or when. How? And Harry was damned upset when Rowley was arrested, Milton added. Naturally. Edna stared hard at the two men before her, wondering just how obtuse they were. You do realize that Harry's not just any stockman, don't you? Clyde shifted uncomfortably. Rowley's never... And Harry hasn't either. Of course. He didn't. They wouldn't. It's probably impolite, Edna sighed. But look at the way they are with each other. How could they not be? They grew up together, Ed. Rowley's mother nearly fainted when she saw Harry. He's Aboriginal, Ed. Just because Rowley takes a man as he finds him doesn't mean his mother does. Milton interrupted. It doesn't matter whether Harry's an ordinary stockman or Rowley's or not. In fact, if he isn't, it's probably more likely that he killed old Mr. Sinclair and Hayden. I can't believe you're suggesting this, Edna said furiously. I'm not suggesting anything, Ed, the poet said firmly. But we have to consider every possibility, and Harry is definitely a possibility. Chapter 25. Dear Old Fruit. Modern Marriage Proposal. Mr. A.E. Bell, a London solicitor, in a paper on Is the Law an Ass at the Law Society's conference at Eastbourne recently, declared that in these days marriage settlements were mere pamphlets. Betrothed beings nowadays, he said, court by telephone and marriage settlement each other by letter. He gave an example of a super up-to-date marriage contract which read, Dear Old Fruit, suppose we park ourselves at the altar together. You shall have the run of my rabbit warren and all its gadgets. You know that my jolly old life has had something done to it. I mean to say that when old Daddy Time throws a monkey wrench into my works, some giddy insurance company will hand you a cool 1,000 and you can have my bank overdraft and everything what's over. All the best. The Advertiser, 1928. Oh, for the love of God, Wilfrid muttered. What's wrong? Roland asked, wondering what Edna Walling had done now. He had accompanied his brother out into the dam paddock to inspect her progress. The works were significant. An arboretum was being planted on the open ground which sloped gently towards what would be a grand cobble-edged pond. The dam, which had been drained a few weeks before, had been partially refilled with soil. A massive mound of clay which had once lined the dam was awaiting use in sealing the new pond. A dozen men toiled with wheelbarrows and shovels, and the garden designer directed proceedings from the midst of it all. It was none of this, however, that had prompted Wilfrid's outburst. Instead, it was the fact that Edna Higgins was on her knees beside the mound, sculpting figures with the clay lining of his pond. Her arms were caked with clay to the elbow, as were her feet and shins. Her shoes had been discarded on the grass a short distance away. Roland stopped, entranced. Edna seemed to him to be drawing shapes out from the earth, conjuring form from the dirt. There was a glorious immersion about her focus that enchanted him. Like a child absorbed, she took complete abandoned joy in what she was doing, forgetting any regard for clothes or propriety. To Roland, this was when she was at her most beautiful, the uninhibited, uncontainable sprite who'd enslaved him from the first. He reached inside his jacket for his notebook, determined to capture the moment, to record what he'd need to paint the sculptress like this. He found a tree stump just a few yards away, against which he settled. Accustomed to being Roland's model, Edna ignored him entirely when she noticed him at all. Wilfrid stared incredulously as his brother began to draw the woman playing with mud in his paddock. He threw his arms in the air and walked away. For a time nobody bothered either artist or sculptress as work on the paddock continued. It was Jack Templeton who first wheeled his barrow up to Edna. "Miss Higgins," he said, tipping his broad-brimmed hat.
"Hello, Mr. Templeton," Edna replied, brushing the hair from her face and smearing it with red clay in the process.
"Can I ask what you're doing there, Miss Higgins?"
She smiled. Templeton stepped closer, drawn by her.
"I saw people in the clay,"
she said, running her hand over one of the smooth bodies now sculpted into the mound, rounded, fluid figures that spoke of the earth in form and substance.
"But Miss Walling said we have to use this clay to line the pond."
Templeton stared in awe at what Edna had created.
"I know."
"But it'll all be destroyed."
"No, they'll always be there in the clay. I've set them free now."
Templeton's brow rose.
"You'd be pulling my leg, Miss Higgins."
Edna laughed.
"No, I'm not. Well, maybe a little. I only wanted to see what they looked like. They can go into the pond now."
"But they'll be wrecked. No one will ever see them."
Templeton sounded genuinely distressed.
"I've seen them," Edna replied. "You've seen them, and I think Rowley may even have drawn them."
Roland stood. "I don't know, Ed. I wasn't really trying to capture your mud people." He looked critically through his sketches. "I may have caught them in the background." Templeton was clearly startled by the presence of Roland, who he'd apparently not noticed till then. One didn't expect graziers to be lying about in paddocks.
"Mr. Sinclair, sir, I didn't see you there."
"Hello, Templeton. Did you enjoy a good Christmas?" Roland closed his notebook, stepping over to inspect more closely what Edna had carved into the walls of the mound.
"I did. I haven't spent Christmas in Yass for some time."
"You're from around here?" Roland asked.
"Born and bred, sir. I lived here as a boy. This place hasn't changed all that much."
Roland laughed. "Don't let Will hear you say that. He's convinced that Yass is a shining example of progress and development. In fact, I'm sure he believes this is the real national capital." Templeton grinned.
"There are a few more people in town, I suppose, but the Sinclairs are still in charge."
He looked back at Edna's sculptures.
"I don't feel right just shoveling this into the pond. It's smashing."
Edna rescued her shoes from the grass. That smile again, and both men caught their breath.
"Why, thank you, Mr. Templeton. But it's not going to last anyway. There are too many impurities in the clay to fire it, even if we could build a big enough pit. Don't feel bad."
Templeton removed his hat and wiped his forehead, bewildered.
"But then why did you—"
"I saw them there when I looked at the clay, and I just couldn't help myself. I had to dig them out,"
Edna explained, confusing Templeton further. Roland understood. Edna often saw shapes that others could not, hints of form imprisoned within a medium. It was in her nature to liberate them. Templeton picked up his shovel, then placed it back in the wheelbarrow, shaking his head vehemently.
"I can't do it," he said. "I'll have to talk to Miss Walling."
"Oh, dear,"
Edna said as they watched him go.
"I didn't mean to make things difficult."
A laugh, loud, deep, and familiar. Harry Simpson strode across the paddock towards them. He stopped with his arms folded across his broad chest, gazing at the rotund figures protruding from the mound of clay, and chuckled.
"Will said Miss Higgins was playing in the mud. I had to come have a look."
"I'm so glad you did, Mr. Simpson," Edna retorted brightly. "You can help Rowley and me shovel them into the pond."
"I beg your pardon?"
"Mr. Templeton feels bad breaking them up, and he shouldn't. The pond needs to be lined, and this was just an experiment."
She picked up a handful of the clay soil and showed the stockman its consistency. Harry Simpson nodded sagely as if he knew what she was talking about.
"I really was just messing around. They won't last," she said earnestly.
Simpson looked at Roland, who was removing his jacket, resigned to the task ahead. "She does this kind of thing all the time, Harry. I don't think there's a cake of soap at Woodlands that Ed hasn't whittled into some creature or other. Sculptors, you know. He rolled up his sleeves. We'd best get on with it before Arthur discovers there are naked mud people in the paddock. It was late afternoon by the time they finished breaking up the sculpted mound and wheelbarrowing it into the pond. Indeed, the enterprise might have taken a good deal longer if Clyde and Milton had not come out to help. Alarmed both by the destruction of the sculptures and the fact that Roland was shoveling dirt in a three-piece suit, Templeton returned with Victor Bates, who seemed as aghast as his workmate. Touched by their concern, Edna showed the gardeners Roland's sketchbook in an attempt to explain that what she'd been doing was equivalent to an artist's sketch, a whim or a notion rather than a fully conceived work. The burly workman took in the contents of the notebook. Bates's mouth fell open and Templeton turned a quite interesting shade of pink. Roland smiled, very much doubting that his sketches were actually making the point Edna intended. Once the clay had been moved, they left the garden designer and her men to put it to the use for which it had been collected, and called by Simpson's cottage to clean up a fraction before returning to the main house. The men were still in a reasonable state, but Edna looked rather like she should have been part of her own sculpture. Harry Simpson handed the muddy sculptress a towel and a cake of sunlight soap. "Now that's to wash with, not to carve," he warned, breaking into a grin. "I see Rowley's been telling tales," Edna replied, enjoying the sound of Simpson's giggle. It was ridiculous on a man so large and strong and otherwise rugged, uninhibited and contagious. She could not hear it without smiling. While Edna was inside the cottage trying to make herself presentable, the men waited on the veranda. Simpson settled himself in the old squatter's chair and regarded Roland sternly. "Why don't you hurry up and marry that girl?" he asked. Both Clyde and Milton pulled up, startled. It was not that they were unaware of Roland's enduring torch for the sculptress, but that they had decided long ago it was a matter best left alone. Roland looked at Simpson and responded plainly, if a little reluctantly. "I'm afraid she wouldn't have me, Harry." "Afraid? Have I taught you nothing, Guggerman?" "Nothing at all." "Don't be smart, Rowley." The stockman would not have it. "You're not a bad catch. Aside from your current legal difficulties, you should ask her. Take flowers. No, chocolates. Take chocolates. And get down on one knee. I'm pretty sure that's what Will did." Roland laughed. "I'm serious, Rowley," Simpson persisted. "What are you waiting for?" "Ed's not—" Roland struggled to explain. Clyde maintained a sympathetic silence, but Milton decided to help. "Ed's a complicated girl, Harry," he said. "She's not the marrying kind." "But if Rowley told her, it wouldn't end well, believe you me. I've known her since we were knee-high," Milton sighed, beckoning Simpson to lean closer as he lowered his voice. "Ed's mother was a Dickensian kind of mad, raised Ed to never belong to a man." "But surely she can see," Milton shrugged. "Perhaps we're all products of our parents' regrets. Ed won't settle down, Harry. Over the years, all the blokes daft enough to propose simply disappeared." "What happened to them?" Simpson asked sceptically. "Don't know. Some of them were barely more than boys, poor souls. Just know we never saw them again." Roland smiled. "I'm sure she didn't devour them, Harry." "I wouldn't count on that," Milton muttered. In an attempt to deflect the discussion, Roland told Simpson about his and Milton's stint at Long Bay and his rather elucidating conversation with Wilfrid. Simpson cursed, standing up. "You didn't shoot him. It wasn't you?" he said, incredulous. "Bloody oath!" "You thought it was me too," Roland groaned. "Why do you reckon I threw the gun into the dam?" Milton glanced at Clyde. "I didn't know that you had, Harry. What were you doing at the house?" "Will sent one of the Kendall boys to fetch me. I got there just as Will's mate left." "What mate?" "Some chap he was meeting with." "Menzies? He was at the house?" "Don't know his name, Rowley. Will didn't exactly introduce me." Simpson rubbed the stubble on his jaw. "Will told me what had happened. Well, what he thought had happened. He gave me the gun.
a silver candlestick and some other odds and ends to make it look like a robbery and told me to get rid of the lot." "And you threw it into the dam?" Milton asked. "Yes. That dam's never run dry, so I thought it would be safe at the bottom of it." Simpson leaned on the veranda rail, his shoulder up against Roland's. "I'm sorry, Gigerman. We should have known you'd never—"
"Don't be too sorry, Harry," Roland said. "I thought about it, I just didn't get the chance." Simpson sighed.
"You might need a better defence than that, mate."
"When Rowley was arrested," Milton asked carefully, "you said you were sorry. Why?" Simpson glanced at Roland.
"That wasn't anything to do with the arrest," he said. "I was sorry I'd upset Mrs. Sinclair is all. I know she isn't well anymore."
Roland stared out towards the homestead. "She's forgotten me completely, but you she remembers, even after all these years."
"As I said, Rowley,"
Simpson replied quietly, "I'm sorry." Roland found his brother in the library. Wilfrid studied him disapprovingly as he poured them both a drink. "You decided to assist Miss Higgins, then?" he said, nodding disdainfully at the smears of clay and dirt on his brother's suit. "I suppose Kate's pond has been replaced with some monstrosity made of mud and sticks." Roland grinned. "No, your clay has been safely returned to the ignominy of being pond lining." Wilfrid shook his head, exasperated. "Will, I was just talking to Harry about the night Father died." Wilfrid looked up sharply. "The chap you were meeting that night, Menzies. You brought him back here?" Wilfrid nodded. "Yes, that turned out to be rather a mistake." "He was a business associate, then?" Wilfrid said nothing for a moment. He stood up and closed the library door. "Bob Menzies and I were at the time vying for the hand of the same young woman." Roland choked on his gin. "What? Really?" "We had both been pursuing a Melbourne girl, Miss Patty Lecky, with some vigour. For pity's sake, Rowley, stop looking so stunned. Did you suppose I was in a monastery before I married Kate?" "No, I just didn't expect—" "Sorry, go on." "Miss Lecky had, at that stage, accepted neither of us." Roland tried to follow. "So why exactly were you meeting with your rival for the young lady's affections?" "To decide the question of Miss Lecky." "I beg your pardon?" "We met to resolve the issue of Miss Lecky's hand. Obviously we couldn't both prevail." "You're not serious?" Roland said, unable to mask his astonishment. Wilfrid rolled his eyes. "It was 1920, Rowley. We'd moved past pistols at dawn." "So, I assume you resolved to stand aside?" "It became clear that Mr. Menzies was much more committed to the proposition than I. He was desperate for Miss Lecky to accept him." "And you conceded? Just like that?" Roland pressed, finding it difficult to believe his brother had walked away so easily. "It was more of a negotiation," Wilfrid said carefully. "I had business priorities, and Menzies felt his only chance lay with me stepping aside gracefully." "Why?" "Well, aside from the obvious, Bob Menzies didn't serve." Wilfrid's tone made his disapproval clear. "He assumed I'd use the DSO to unfair advantage, had some notion that Miss Lecky would be won with war medals." "And what did he offer you in this negotiation?" Wilfrid scowled. "Not a great deal, if truth be told. He begged. It was bloody awkward, embarrassing for all concerned." "I see." Roland tried not to smile. "So why did you bring him here?" "He was so flaming grateful he insisted on dropping me back. I felt obliged to invite him in for a drink. We came in through the conservatory." Wilfrid frowned, sipping his whiskey sullenly. "Mrs. Kendall called me aside. She was in rather a state. I told Menzies to make himself comfortable in the drawing-room and went to Father's study." "Harry saw him leave much later," Roland said, "after Father had been shot. He must have been in the drawing-room for hours." Wilfrid shrugged. "I'm not sure why he stayed, Rowley. To be honest, I forgot about him entirely." He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "When I came back down, he was still there. God knows what he heard or what he was doing. I apologized. He said he understood. I poured him another drink, and then we heard the gunshot."
"He was with you when Father was shot. My God, Will, why didn't you tell the police?"
Wilfrid frowned. "I left him in the drawing room whilst I went to the study. I saw you. Thought it was you. I was worried that Bob might have seen you too. I just wanted to get him out of there."
"And he was happy to simply go?"
"Bob Menzies was a barrister, Rowley. He was leading an important constitutional case before the High Court, his first, I believe. He couldn't be associated with any sort of scandal, however peripherally."
"And you've never spoken about it?" Roland asked, not entirely unaware of the irony of the question.
"I was a guest at his wedding later that year. By that time the official version was that Father had been killed during a robbery by a person or persons unknown. He expressed his condolences. I congratulated him on his marriage."
"We should speak to him, Will. Perhaps he saw something. At the very least, he could alibi you."
Wilfrid grimaced. "Menzies is the current Deputy Premier of Victoria, Rowley, and I very much doubt he'll want to be associated with scandal now any more than he did then."
He pressed his fingers together pensively.
"In any case, it's you who's been charged."
"Thus far," Roland countered.
He told his brother of the anonymous informant who insisted that it was Wilfrid Sinclair that the police should be charging. "The only reason the police are not taking it seriously is that I was clearly not disinherited." "Clearly. But they may yet come back to the theory, Will." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, really." Wilfrid Sinclair's eyes darkened. "Did Detective Delaney have any idea who this informant was?"
"No, he just assumed it was some disgruntled business associate of yours."
Wilfrid sighed. "I'll telephone Bob Menzies. To be honest, I'm now rather curious as to what he was doing all evening."
Roland stood to leave. "I'd better wash up." He stopped, somehow compelled to ask, "If you'd had a rival for Kate's hand, would you have—"
"Negotiated?"
Wilfrid looked hard at him over the top of his spectacles. The barest hint of a smile played about his lips.
"No. For Katie, it was always pistols at dawn."
Roland nodded. "That's what I thought."
"Rowley," Wilfrid said as his brother reached for the door handle, "I've not mentioned Miss Lecky to Kate."
"I see.
Be a good chap and keep this conversation strictly between you and me."
"Menzies can alibi you, Will."
"We'll deal with that if it becomes necessary. Right now, I want nothing else to upset my wife. So let this be on the square."
Chapter 26. Sydney Wool Sales. Prices again firmer. Sydney, Tuesday. Prices showed a farther hardening tendency on yesterday's improved rates at the wool sale today. The market was very animated, competition being well distributed. The buying on German account was again a prominent feature. Greasy merino fleece sold to 35 pence for 5 bales from Rylestone and 5 bales from Yass. The offerings totalled 11,482 bales, of which 11,386 were sold at auction, while an additional 1,296 were disposed of privately. The Canberra Times, 10th of January 1934.
Henry Sinclair's study had been unused since the night he died nearly 14 years before. Wilfrid had bypassed his father's throne room for a study nearer the library and further from Henry's shadow. The oak-panelled chamber was dusted weekly, but otherwise it remained untouched. Until now, Roland had not set foot in it since the shooting. He drew the drapes, allowing in the soft light of a wet summer's day. Standing before his father's desk again felt strange. The perspective was different. He was taller now. The wall behind the desk was bare. It had once held the portrait of Henry which currently hung in the drawing-room at Woodlands. Roland exhaled slowly. He was tense. There was an odd metallic taste in his mouth. He was suddenly glad that Wilfrid would not hear of communists rifling through their father's papers and had insisted that any search be conducted without them. The study was spacious, incorporating its own library and a sitting area where Henry would occasionally entertain business associates. and which was large enough to allow his manager to swing a leather strap against his son. The walls were decorated with photographs of prize-winning rams, and the bookshelves burdened with trophies and ribbons from the Royal Easter Show. An inscribed 5-iron, which had been presented to Henry Sinclair by the Royal Sydney Golf Club, was mounted on the far wall beside various other commemorations of the gentleman's civic philanthropy. Roland loosened his tie. He didn't like being here, even now with his father long dead. As much as he tried to forget it, to never think of it, this part of his memory was still too clear. He composed himself and began to go through the desk, not entirely sure what he expected to find. In the beginning he searched carefully, putting everything back as it had been. But then he found his father's Bible in the second drawer, and something snapped. Cursing Henry Sinclair, Roland pulled the drawer out and upturned it unceremoniously on the desk. He rummaged through the contents, discarding documents and calling cards onto the floor. He upended the next drawer and the next until the desk was buried in papers, massive ledgers and old inkwells. The diary was in the bottom drawer, leather-bound, embossed with the Sinclair crest. Roland flicked through to the Monday his father had died. Several meetings were entered in Henry's florid hand, including a large block of time marked simply Roland. He stared at the page, his chest tightening. His father had made an appointment for him. Knowing what he intended to do to his son, Henry Sinclair had scheduled enough time to do the job properly. Roland slammed the diary shut and flung it across the room. For several minutes he could do nothing but seethe and swear. He racked his brain for some forgotten recollection. Was there something from that evening he'd forgotten, some clue as to who else was in the house? Parts of that night seemed vivid, whilst others were confused. He was no longer sure how accurate his memories were. He moved to the door and, turning back, determined where exactly he'd seen his father's body and in what position. The Axminster carpet had been removed, so there was no longer any indication that a man had bled and died on that spot. Assuming Wilfrid had not moved the body, it seemed to him that the murderer must have been quite close to the door to the adjoining hallway when he fired the fatal shot. Henry Sinclair had died in front of the desk, not behind it. Did that mean he was stepping forward to greet his attacker? Roland retrieved the diary from the floor and, taking a steadying breath, turned back to the relevant page. The entries made for earlier the day Henry died were recorded in more detail. Roland's eye caught on a notation for midday. Mullins. Execution. The door squeaked open and Ernest Sinclair peered timidly in. He stared agog at the papers and books strewn about the study, the empty drawers stacked on the desk in a precarious tower. "Hello, Ernie. What are you doing here?"
"I heard thumping. I thought it was the ghost."
"The ghost?" Ernest walked in, Lenin padding contentedly behind him.
"Nobody's allowed in this room, Uncle Rowley,"
he said gravely. He beckoned Roland down and whispered,
"Someone died in here. It's haunted."
"Haunted? Who told you that, mate?"
"It is, Uncle Rowley. Sometimes you can hear someone crying in here."
Roland hesitated, unsure what to say. "There's no such thing as ghosts, Ernie."
"Yes, there is," Ernest declared. "I've heard it."
He took his uncle's hand.
"I'm not scared, though."
"Does your father know about this ghost?"
"Daddy said I was never to go in here."
"Because of the ghost?"
"I suppose."
"Perhaps we should talk to him," Roland said, deciding that it was really up to Wilfrid how much he told his son. He reached up with his free hand and took the golf club from its mounting.
"He might be cross,"
Ernest warned.
"Nobody's allowed in this room."
Maintenance work in the holding yards at Wainwright's came to a momentary stop when the yellow Mercedes pulled up. 3 men alighted. Most of the workers recognized the giant indigenous man with blue eyes. The man who slipped out from behind the steering wheel was a stranger, but looked like he may easily have been one of Simpson's stockmen. It was the 3rd man who caused them to stop and look again. For his part, Milton Isaacs considered the green velvet jacket and striped waistcoat a smart and fetching ensemble, given a rural flair by the red kerchief he wore in place of his usual cravat. Simpson led them up the steps onto the loading stage and into the shearing shed just as the rain began. Though neither as large nor as well equipped as Oakley, Wainwright's still boasted a substantial shed of some 12 stands. Of course, the shearing was done and the shed was currently empty, but for a single man undertaking maintenance on the mechanized stands and holding pens. John Barrett looked up as the men from Oakley came into his shed. Harry Simpson nodded.
"John, how would you be?"
Barrett shook his hand.
"Fit as a Mallee bull, Harry. Heard you've had a bit of strife at Oakley."
"Could say that." Simpson introduced Milton Isaacs and Clyde Watson-Jones, explaining that they were Roland's friends from the city. Barrett glanced at Milton and nodded as if that explained a few things. Then Simpson and Barrett talked about the weather for a while. Clyde and Milton waited, allowing Simpson to lead them through whatever parochial protocol was necessary. Finally, Simpson raised the matter for which they'd come.
"You know Charlie Hayden's body was found at Imarua."
Barrett sighed.
"I heard. Bad business, but can't say I'm mourning. Been expecting the police to come talk to me. Why? 'Cause I didn't like the bugger. After that day in the shed, wasn't no secret."
"What exactly happened, Mr. Barrett?" Clyde ventured. "We've heard Hayden's side of it." Perhaps Barrett would not think to be defensive if they asked about Charles Hayden instead.
"What's it to you?"
Barrett was suspicious nevertheless. "The police are looking at Rowley for it," Clyde replied, carefully omitting the fact that Roland had already been arrested and charged. Barrett frowned.
"I don't know if what I could tell you would help him."
He leant back against the stall and, taking out a tin of tobacco and some papers, rolled a cigarette.
"The boy was back on holidays from that posh school they sent him to. Half me men had enlisted, and we were trying to get the clip in. Roland seemed a bit lost, used to watch. He had nothing better to do, I suppose."
Barrett shrugged.
"He was a good lad, quiet, didn't try to throw his weight around like some of the graziest boys do. We'd stopped for smoko, and I thought I'd teach him to shear just for a lark. The kid surprised me. He might have made a shearer. Hayden told us to get back to work. I told him to bugger off. We still had 15 minutes. He strode back with Mr. Sinclair in tow. Bloody coward."
Barrett cupped his hands, lit up, and drew deeply. He coughed and picked a few moist strands of tobacco from his cigarette.
"Old Mr. Sinclair sacked me right out. Got Hayden to flog the boy then and there so that none of the other blokes would ever think about talking to the boss's son again. For his sake, if not theirs."
He shook his head.
"Poor bloody kid. That bastard made sure the boy was too bloomin' humiliated to ever show his face in the shed again. There were a few of us who talked about killing Hayden then."
"What about Mr. Sinclair?"
"He was a mean, black-hearted mongrel. But what can you do? He was the boy's father. If he hadn't died, I reckon he might have killed the kid in the end."
"Look, John," Simpson said, "Rowley doesn't want the police to even talk to you if it isn't necessary."
"I appreciate that.
But we still need to know everything you can remember." Barrett looked at Simpson.
"Yeah, I can see what you're saying."
He drew again on his cigarette.
"I was in Sydney at the wool sales with Mr. Wainwright when we heard about Mr. Sinclair. We came back straight away."
"Why?"
"Mr. Wainwright was a mate of Mr. Wilfred Sinclair's. Had no time for the old man. That's why he was willing to give me a job, I suppose. But he thought he should show his respects."
"What about Hayden?" Milton asked.
"If I'd wanted to kill Hayden, I'd have done it 15 years ago. I heard he was back, bragging that he was finally evening the score, being compensated for what Wilfred Sinclair did to him."
"Compensated? How?"
"Dunno. He was shouting rounds at the commercial. Certainly wasn't skint.
Do you have any idea as to who might have wanted to kill him, Mr. Barrett? Clyde asked. Barrett dropped the stub of his cigarette and crushed it under his heel.
Look, not many people liked Hayden. He was a downright bully, a coward, but he picked his targets. You worked for him until Wilfred Sinclair sacked him, Harry. Did he give you any grief?
No, Simpson admitted. He stayed out of my way. I had no idea of what the boss was using him to do. Barrett nodded.
He didn't take on any bloke who could stand up to him.
The shearer folded his arms.
I wish I could help you. I liked the kid. Used to think he had it made. And then that day in the shed.
Barrett cursed.
My old man used to clip me round the ear too, and I'd come out and kick the dog. But I never saw Rowland do anything like that.
No, Simpson said. Rowley likes dogs. Barrett snorted, shoving Simpson good-naturedly. They took their leave of John Barrett then and sprinted through the rain back to the Mercedes. Clyde started the engine, noting with not a small measure of trepidation that the dirt road was quickly turning to mud in the deluge. He drove slowly because visibility was poor.
So what do you think?
Milton asked from the back seat.
Rowley's right. Barrett didn't shoot anybody,
Clyde replied, craning his head out of the window to see more clearly.
No, I know that. I meant what he said about Hayden having money.
What do you mean? Simpson asked. Well, when Hayden first emerged, we thought it odd that he should appear just when the gun was found. I'm starting to suspect we were right. It's more than coincidence. Clyde nodded. You may have a point. Delaney's been telling us from the beginning that the police have an anonymous informant.
So who's behind us?
Simpson looked back at Milton.
Do you suppose it might be Campbell and his bodyguard?
Milton posed. Maybe. Clyde kept his eyes glued to what little road he could see. Campbell's a solicitor. He'd certainly know how to stir up this kind of trouble. He'd probably also know how to access the original records on Henry's murder. Milton frowned.
But how would he even know to look? It was widely reported in the newspapers when it happened as a burglary come murder, of course, Simpson informed them. Lot of features on Will taking over the reins of the Sinclair Empire.
So perhaps we're talking about Wilfred's enemies, not Rowley's, Milton suggested.
But they're pointing at Rowley for murder, not Will.
Did you blokes see anybody the night Lennon was shot? Milton asked suddenly.
No, why?
Just think we let that go too easily. Someone might have been trying to shoot Rowley.
Will's convinced it was just some fool shooting rabbits.
Simpson's misgivings were apparent in his voice. Watch it, Clyde, Milton warned as the Mercedes slid sideways in the mud. Clyde reacted quickly, using the steering to bring the car back to the road and under control. I worked in a gang of shearers once, he muttered, clearly brooding over what Barrett had described. They were tough blokes, pretty bloody hard to shock, I'd say. God, poor Rowley. How could you do that to your own boy?
When Aubrey died, I gather the boss thought the good Lord took him as atonement, Simpson said.
Atonement for what exactly? Simpson raised his thick, dark brow.
Past indiscretions. Aubrey and I were about the same age. He frowned thoughtfully. As boys, we were all wary of the boss's walking cane, he confessed. But I think the Bible-reading business must have started after Aubrey died. Perhaps he was flogging himself as much as Rowley.
I don't know, Harry. It sounds to me like Henry Sinclair was just a mean, sadistic mongrel.
What the hell?
The car jolted as it collected a rut in the road. Clyde swore. The wheels began to spin. He stopped the Mercedes and put it into reverse, but the back wheels didn't have traction. It seemed they were bogged. He cursed again. Simpson turned towards Milton.
Looks like you and I are pushing, mate.
No point in this rain, Clyde said. We're stuck. We'll just have to wait till the rain stops and then chock the ruts with something. Wilfred was on the back veranda with one of his managers. They spoke loudly over the pounding of the rain upon the tin roof as they discussed wool prices, which had apparently recovered to record levels. The Oakley bales were already in Sydney, safely stored at the Goldsborough Mort wool store, ready for auction whenever Wilfrid gave the word. Despite the extraordinary prices, Wilfrid was holding back most of the Oakley clip, convinced the market would climb even further. Ernest left Roland's side and stood by his father, listening intently with his hands clasped behind his back. Roland had no doubt that his nephew already knew far more than he did about wool. There was a solemn perspicacity about Ernest that more than anything else identified him as Wilfrid's son. Roland, on the other hand, had difficulty even feigning interest in the finer points of wool classing, let alone breeding programs. Generally, he just signed whatever Wilfrid put in front of him, repaying his brother's commitment to expanding the Sinclair fortune by not interfering. Every now and then, Wilfrid felt the need to drag him to a meeting or have him appointed to some board or subcommittee, but they both knew their roles. The conversation moved from the wool clip to the weather, which had turned rather dramatically. Fortunately, the last of the cereal harvest was in, and so the deluges of the past day would cause the property very little trouble. In time, the manager tipped his hat and wished them all good night. Wilfrid ruffled his son's hair. "And what have you two been up to?" Ernest clammed up, clasping his hands over his mouth. Roland smiled. Clearly the boy was not a poker player. Wilfrid glanced at the presentation club in Roland's hand. His brow arched. "What do you want with that?" he asked. "I'm going to work on my chip shot." Wilfrid started to say something and then elected to stop. "I take it you were in Father's study?" he said instead. Roland nodded. "Yes." "Did you go in?" Wilfrid asked his son.
"Only to tell Uncle Rowley that he wasn't allowed in there."
Ernest glanced nervously at Roland.
"Uncle Rowley didn't make the mess. It was like that when he got there."
"Just as well," Wilfrid said, allowing Ernest's clumsy attempt to cover up for his uncle to pass without comment. "Did you find anything?" he asked, turning to Roland. "Perhaps, but Ernie told me something much more interesting." On cue, Ernest told his father about the ghost. Wilfrid listened grimly. "I expect we should have a chat, Ernie. You have a few things backwards, old chap."
"Oh."
Ernest's face fell.
"So there's no ghost?"
"I very much doubt it." Roland leaned against a veranda post, listening. He was more than a little intrigued as to how his brother would handle Ernest's guileless curiosity. Wilfrid invited his son to sit and took the squatter's chair opposite. "Your grandfather, Sinclair, died in that room, Ernie."
"When?"
"A long time ago, son, before you were born. We don't talk about it because it upsets your grandmother."
"Doesn't it upset you?"
"Of course, but I'm a man. So are you. It's important that we are considerate of the ladies."
"Would Grandma cry if we talked about it?"
"Possibly."
"She doesn't cry when we talk about Uncle Aubrey and he died. She thinks he's Uncle Rowley."
Wilfrid sighed. "Your uncles look very much alike, so your grandmother gets mixed up sometimes."
"Why don't you tell her?"
"Tell her what?"
"Which one's which?"
Roland couldn't help but smile as Wilfrid began to look somewhat flustered. "It's more complicated than that, Ernie. You'll understand when you're older."
"Grandma's older and she's all mixed up."
"Now you're being cheeky, young man," Wilfrid said sternly. "Mr. Sinclair, excuse me, sir." Jack Templeton interrupted them, appearing quite suddenly from the deluge. He removed his hat and wiped the water from his eyes with muddy hands. "Miss Walling sent me to tell you, sir, that the rain is causing problems. We're just going to dig a trench to divert the overflow and minimise the damage until this is over." "Yes, very good, Templeton. Carry on." Templeton twisted his hat, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm afraid Miss Walling is having a few difficulties with Mr. McNair. He seems quite agitated, sir." "McNair? What the dickens is he belly-aching about now?" "I'm afraid, sir, that we haven't been able to work that out." Roland laughed. McNair, Wilfrid's permanent gardener, had a particular mumbling manner of speaking which seemed to render only the random profanity comprehensible. Wilfrid was the only person who understood the man. Wilfrid stood. "I best go out with you. If you'll wait here, I'll fetch a raincoat."
"Can I come too, Mr. Templeton?"
Ernest asked, once his father had stepped inside. Templeton squatted to speak with the boy face to face. "No, you'd best stop here in the dry like a good boy." He ruffled Ernest's hair. "When the rain stops, Vic and I will hang a swing for you in the elm tree if you like." Chapter 27. Yass River Rising. The Yass River was running high at 6 p.m. last night, but had not reached dangerous proportions. However, very heavy rain commenced to fall shortly after 8 o'clock, and it was feared that a sudden rise was imminent. Campers on the river bank have all shifted to higher ground, and it is thought that sufficient warning has been given to enable stock and property to be safeguarded. The Canberra Times, 8th of January, 1934. It was quite late in the day when Milton arrived back at Oakley. He was dripping, muddy, and his green velvet jacket had clearly seen better days.
"Oh, Mr. Isaacs, what in heaven's name are you doing out in this rain?"
Mrs. Kendall exclaimed as she opened the door. "I drew the short straw, I'm afraid."
"Milt!"
Edna joined the housekeeper in the vestibule.
"Where have you been?"
"We got bogged," Milton said, stopping on the veranda. He removed his sodden jacket, wringing the water from the sleeves and muttering, "Thought we'd wait for the rain to stop, but it doesn't seem inclined to break any time soon."
"For goodness sake, Mr. Isaacs, come in before you catch your death,"
Mrs. Kendall ordered. Milton paused to shake his head like a wet dog before crossing the threshold. "Harry Simpson said I should tell Mr. Sinclair to send one of his caterpillars for them."
"Caterpillar?"
Edna asked. "It's a tractor," Roland said from the hallway. "Good Lord, how long have you been stuck?" "We gave up on the rain letting up an hour ago, and they sent me for help." "I'll drive out and get them," Roland said, grabbing his hat from the hall stand. "I'm afraid we took your car, Roly." "Oh." The alarm was evident on Roland's face. "We'd better organize that caterpillar and some tow chains, then." The available caterpillar was stored in the same shed on Emo Ruo in which the Rule Britannia was housed. It was, as luck would have it, not far from where the yellow Mercedes had become hopelessly bogged. Jack Templeton volunteered to undertake the rescue. Wilfrid sent the gardener out to collect the tractor on horseback to avoid bogging another car, dismissing out of hand any notion that Roland accompany him. "I'm sure Templeton can manage to pull that Fritz monstrosity out on his own," he muttered. Reluctantly, Roland conceded, giving Templeton instructions on where and how to attach the tow chain. "Don't you worry, Mr. Sinclair," Templeton said as he set off in the rain yet again. "I'll be real gentle with her." Wilfrid snorted. He'd never quite reconciled his brother's insistence on keeping the German automobile. "Just let the man do his job," he growled. "Templeton's a good hand. I'm thinking about keeping him on once Miss Walling has finished up." "Won't you need him?" "Apparently he and the other one, Bates, are just filling in for one of her usual contractors. They asked me if I'd consider giving them jobs as gardeners. I don't need two, but I'm inclined to take Templeton on." "What about McNair?" Roland asked. He imagined the taciturn gardener might have something to say on the subject. Wilfrid sighed. "I'll talk to him. He could doubtless use some more help about the place. These blasted gardens will take some upkeep, and I'm afraid poor old McNair just wants to plant pumpkins." Roland was waiting in the garage when Clyde brought in the Mercedes. Edna had come out to keep him company while Milton was recovering with a generous balloon of Wilfrid's finest brandy. Harry Simpson had, of course, been dropped off at his cottage, and Templeton was returning the caterpillar and picking up his horse. Clyde chuckled as Roland fussed over the mud-splattered automobile. "She's fine, Rowley, just a bit wet." Roland patted the grill. "She does seem to have survived the indignity of it all." "Perhaps you could draw her a hot bath," Edna suggested, rolling her eyes. "It might calm her nerves." "I'm glad you came out to check on her, actually," Clyde said as Roland stood, satisfied his beloved car was none the worse for the experience.
"I wanted to talk to you." "How did you fare with John Barrett?" Roland asked.
Clyde recounted the conversation.
"It got us thinking again that perhaps Charlie Hayden appearing out of the blue wasn't just an inconvenient coincidence."
"You believe someone paid him to come back?"
"It makes sense, Rowley. Harry and I went over it while we were waiting for help to arrive."
"Harry believes there's someone behind all this too?" Roland asked. Clyde nodded.
"What's more, Rowley, we don't think you should dismiss the fact that someone shot at you. It may not have been an accident."
Roland leaned back on the bonnet of his car, his arms folded, and laughed ruefully. No, it wasn't an accident."
"You know who shot Lennon?"
Edna asked, aghast. As Clyde said, they were shooting at me, got Len by mistake. At first I couldn't for the life of me understand why Will was so adamant it was some near-sighted rabbit hunter. I worked it out eventually.
"Not Will?"
Edna stepped back, appalled. "No, of course not. Will wouldn't have missed, for one thing. It was Lucy Bennett."
"Lucy Bennett? Shot at you?"
"I'm fairly sure. The Colonel probably gave her a pistol to fend off communists. She has a car. She knew I'd be walking back, and she was rather vexed with me."
"But why would Wilfred want to—"
"Lucy is his wife's dearest friend. I expect Kate appealed to Will on Lucy's behalf."
"And Wilfred? Both of you? Are willing to let it go at that?"
Clyde joined Edna in her horror. Roland replied calmly, "I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but it appears shooting a dog is not actually a crime in New South Wales. I don't know that making a fuss would have achieved anything."
"She tried to kill you!"
It was hard to tell if Edna was angrier with Lucy Bennett or Roland. He grimaced. Perhaps Miss Bennett just wished to let me know she was displeased. She was rather distraught.
"Before or after she tried to shoot you?"
Roland smiled apologetically. "I'm convinced she's not dangerous. I expect Miss Bennett gave herself rather more of a shock than she did me."
"So you said nothing?"
"All things considered, it seemed like letting it go was the decent thing to do. I only bring it up so you know it's got nothing to do with the murders." Silence. Then Clyde sighed heavily and pointed sternly at Roland. "You, mate," he said, glancing sideways at Edna, "would be well advised to stop associating with women who shoot at you. The next one might not miss." The unrelenting rain ensured they were more or less confined to barracks for the next few days. It might not have been such an issue if the mix of guests at Oakley were not so volatile. Arthur Sinclair made it clear that he believed his cousin Roland's friends had no business imposing on the family yet again. He was polite, but hostile nonetheless, expressing his antipathy within the bounds of civility. Clyde ignored him, while Milton seemed to find it amusing. Only Edna, for whom he reserved his most obviously contemptuous barbs, faltered occasionally. Inevitably, Roland exploded. He invited Arthur to step outside. The rain, of course, meant they only got as far as the veranda. "You would do well to remember, Arthur, that you are as much a guest here as my friends."
"You think so, do you, Cousin Roland?" Arthur spat. "What the Sinclairs now have was built by my father as much as yours. Mr. Watson-Jones, Mr. Isaacs, and Miss Higgins are here on my invitation and Kate's. They are here to help me establish what happened the night Father was killed." "Don't be bloody daft, Roland. Anyone can see you're being offered up for the greater good. You're finally going to do your part for this family."
"What?" Arthur regarded him with a kind of derisive pity.
"Wilfred has been speaking to doctors. I suspect he's going to keep you out of prison by having you committed." "That's preposterous."
Arthur's expression softened. He grabbed Roland's elbow and lowered his voice.
"Look, Rowley, listen to me. Believe it or not, I am your friend, your ally. 20 years ago, I was you, headstrong, irresponsible, and moving with a bad crowd. I wouldn't listen to anyone until it was too late."
Roland pulled away.
Sinclair men have a common failing. We want to control our sons and brothers. Your father tried to do so, my father tried to do so, and Wilfrid is no different. If you don't fall into line, believe me, Wilfrid will do something drastic."
"You're an idiot, Arthur, and you don't know Will at all." Arthur's smile was smug.
"Wilfrid and I have been working closely for months, Roland. He's come to confide in me, and I know how he feels about having to support his feckless wastrel of a brother and the communist scum with whom he associates."
"I'm not sure why you believe it's any of your business, but Wilfrid does not support me."
"You'll find he does, and all your friends. As for Miss Higgins—"
Roland stopped him.
"Is there any particular reason you're trying to get me to beat the hell out of you, Arthur?"
The question was not rhetorical. It seemed to Roland that his cousin was intentionally trying to goad him.
"For pity's sake, man, I'm trying to help you. Hasn't it occurred to you that there's a reason Will's keeping your gold-digging—"
Roland grabbed Arthur, ready to make good his threat.
"Rowley!"
Wilfrid stepped out onto the veranda and regarded the confrontation incredulously.
"What on earth is going on here? Every time I turn around, you're trying to thump Arthur. You're a grown man, for God's sake."
For a fleeting moment, Roland thought about hitting his cousin anyway, but in the end he released him. Arthur straightened his tie.
"Well?"
Wilfrid demanded. Arthur cleared his throat and smoothed down his lapel. He sniffed.
"You know, Wilfrid, I think it might be best if I go to Sydney for a few days. Lucy will be pleased, I'm sure, and I can continue to do what I can for Roland's defence."
Roland caught himself before he responded in a manner quite ungracious. Wilfrid nodded.
"Perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad idea. I suspect we're all getting a little short-tempered in the circumstances." "Well then, I'd best telephone Lucy. Let her know I'm coming."
He looked at Roland and put his hand out.
"I apologise if I offended you, old chap. I sometimes forget that you've grown up. Shall we say no hard feelings?"
Roland stared at his cousin's hand, still fuming. Reluctantly, because there was no way he could refuse without seeming churlish, he accepted the handshake. Wordlessly he met Arthur's eyes. In them, he could see no sign of retreat. Arthur took the train back to Sydney that afternoon. Elizabeth Sinclair was clearly saddened to see him depart, though he did so with promises that his absence would not be long. She clung to Roland as she waved away the Rolls-Royce.
"I was rather getting used to having all my boys home again,"
she said, dabbing her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief.
"You mustn't leave me again, Aubrey. They'll simply have to carry on this dreadful war without you."
"Fortunately, Mother, the war's over," Roland said quietly.
"So soon?"
Elizabeth Sinclair sighed.
"Well, it's just as well. Perhaps Arthur will be home shortly then. He looked so handsome in his uniform."
Roland frowned. Arthur, of course, had not been wearing a uniform of any sort. To date, it was only her youngest son that his mother saw differently, incorrectly. The development worried him. While Wilfrid accompanied his cousin to the station, Roland and his friends sat in the drawing-room, drinking tea and playing euchre with Kate, while Ernest tore about pretending to be a plane. The conversation was relaxed and inconsequential. Kate's condition, her refined disposition, and her allegiance to Lucy Bennet made it difficult to discuss anything frankly in her presence. Elizabeth Sinclair sat on the settee with a book in her lap. Roland watched the way she clutched the volume when her eyes became vague and frightened. The book gave her something to hold on to, as she tried to remember where she was and what she was doing. He left the card game and sat beside her. She took his hand and held it silently for a while. He let her be as he brooded over his exchange with Arthur. His cousin's conviction that Wilfrid was supporting him was perplexing. Of course, Wilfrid had managed and expanded his brother's assets with the greater Sinclair fortune, but Elizabeth Sinclair squeezed his hand.
"You mustn't make your father angry, darling. You must be as good as you can be."
Roland turned to her, startled. His mother would say those precise words to him when he was a child, before she forgot who he was. He looked into her eyes, searching for some faint spark of recognition.
"Aubrey?"
she said. But he saw her hesitate. "No, Mother. It's Roland. I'm Roland." She gazed up into his face and laughed.
Oh, don't be silly. Roland died.
"No, he didn't. I'm Roland."
"You're being cruel,"
she hissed, pulling away from him, her lips and hands trembling.
"You're playing wicked tricks, Aubrey."
"Mother, please." Elizabeth grabbed his lapel, disintegrating, sobbing.
"I know you're Aubrey. I know."
Ernest stopped pretending he was an aeroplane and ran to his mother. "Yes, of course," Roland said as he tried desperately to soothe her. "I was being silly." Clyde stood and took Ernest from Kate. "What say we play cricket on the veranda, mate?" he said quietly. "We'll let Milt bowl since he can't bat to save his life." Kate smiled uneasily, gratefully, as they took her son away, while Roland tried in vain to calm his mother, who was now both angry and distressed. She lashed out, suddenly unsure who he was altogether. On the face of it, Roland stayed composed. Edna grabbed Kate's hand. "Perhaps we should call for a doctor," she said. "That's a good idea, Miss Higgins." Wilfred Sinclair stepped into the room, having just returned from the station. He stopped only a moment to assess the situation. "Katie, my dear, I think you'd best telephone Maguire. I believe he's not yet returned to Sydney." He spoke evenly, almost severely, to Elizabeth. "Mother, perhaps it's time you had a rest." Elizabeth turned to Wilfred in what looked like terror.
"No, Aubrey needs me. We're reading."
Roland glanced at his brother. "Yes, we are. Why don't I read to you for a while, Mother?" Gently he teased the book from her hands. She stopped fighting him and settled, confused and shaking, back into the settee.
Yes, yes. Read to me, darling. Your father would read to me from the Bible, you know. He was such a strong man, and so handsome."
Roland read, his voice low and metered, betraying almost nothing of his own disappointment and sorrow. It seemed to comfort her. By the time Maguire arrived, Elizabeth Sinclair had become almost listless. Roland carried his mother to her room so that the surgeon could treat her in private. She released her grip on her Aubrey only as the laudanum with which the surgeon treated her began to take effect. Not entirely sure what to do next, Roland joined the makeshift game of cricket on the veranda. Milton handed him the soft rubber ball with no mention of what had just happened. "You bowl, Rowley. We have a young Bradman on our hands." And so they played a game designed to entertain Ernest while breaking no windows, but which also served to distract his uncle a little. They stopped when Maguire walked out of the house with Wilfred. Roland tossed the ball back to Milton and joined them. Frederick Maguire shook his hand. "I'll leave your brother to relay the details, Roland, but it would be best if you don't go in to see your mother right now. Your presence seems to cause her a great deal of conflict and distress. It may be that she's beginning to remember you as Roland rather than Aubrey, but that, in and of itself, is of course associated with her still unresolved grief. Mrs. Sinclair is very fragile at present. In fact, I would suggest her condition is at the lowest ebb I've seen." "Of course. I won't see her, thank you." Maguire took his leave, brusquely in his fashion, before opening a black umbrella to stride out to his awaiting motor-car. Wilfred polished his glasses, which had apparently fogged in the moisture. He regarded Roland somberly. "We'd best have a word, Rowley." This ends CD 7. CD 8. Chapter 28. Duchess of York's cousin as authoress. 12-year-old Sarah Bowes Lyon on the Art of Horsemanship by the Daily News, woman writer abroad. Australians have a literary treat in store, for in London a book has been published which is the essence of joie de vivre. Miss Sarah Bowes Lyon, aged 12 years, a second cousin of the Duchess of York, with her book entitled horsemanship as it is today is likely to achieve world sales and eclipse even The Young Visitors by Daisy Ashford. The etiquette of hunting is expounded at length. Always have a very good breakfast, as you will only have your sandwiches for lunch, writes Sarah. For lunch it is a good thing to have some ginger biscuits, etc., in as well as they do not crumble as much as sandwiches, and take a few bits of plain chocolate to eat for the hack home. You must always start early for the meet, so that you will not be late if you are delayed on the way. When you get there, go and find your pony, and don't forget your sandwich case. If your hostess asks you in, always go and have some coffee. It is rude not to. Always say good morning to the master and then the hunt servants. Anyway, when you get home from hunting, have a hot bath, go to bed, sleep tight, and may you dream of fox hunting. The Daily News, 3rd of January, 1934. Wilfrid led Roland into his own study. Drink? Anything but whiskey. Wilfrid poured him a generous glass of sherry and kept the scotch for himself. I'm sorry, Will, that was my fault. Why? I thought she remembered me for a moment. I pushed her. It was stupid, selfish. Wilfrid sighed. We'll talk about Mother directly, but that's not why I called you in here. I want you to tell me what exactly went on between you and Arthur. That's between Arthur and me, Will. Wilfrid's eyes flashed. Don't be difficult, Rowley. The two of you were shouting at each other on the veranda. I doubt it was particularly confidential. We haven't time for bloody airs and graces. I suspect he was just trying to provoke me, Will. For pity's sake, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Very well. Roland was not in any mood to quarrel over Arthur. Our dear cousin seems to have got the wrong end of several sticks. He recounted the conversation, trying to be as fair as animosity would allow. Wilfrid listened carefully without interrupting. When Roland finished, he stood and retrieved several pages of documents from a cedar cabinet and placed the sheaf before his brother. What is this? Father's last will. He'd signed it the day he died. Roland remembered the entry in his father's diary. Mullin's execution. So Henry Sinclair had not been scheduling the summary murder of some business rival. Relieved, he read through the first interminable sentence with its multiple whereases, moreovers, and thenceforths. What is it you wish me to see, Will? Turn to the next page, second paragraph. Roland read. He sat up, startled. He disinherited me, he said, in stunned belief. Wilfrid came around the desk and took a chair next to Roland's. Father, as a matter of course, disinherited one or the other of us regularly. Poor Ray Mullins must have drafted and redrafted Father's will on a monthly basis. It just so happened that he died that night just after he'd cut you off. If you recall, later that evening he was adamant he'd disinherit me. So this is what Arthur meant when he said you were supporting me and my friends. I am certainly not supporting your communist hordes. Wilfrid took the document out of Roland's hands. Look, Rowley, if I'd had my way, you would never have known about this. When Father died, I restructured all our assets into the family trust from which you receive your income. The accountants will talk you through all the mundane details any time you want. Roland shook his head. All this time, I thought. He stared at his brother. All these years you've been demanding I throw my friends out of Woodlands. You could simply have... Wilfrid's jaw tensed. Father controlled us with pounds and shillings. You were too young to know, but it was how he kept Aubrey and me in line. Who he saw, what we did, what we thought. I came back from the war, only to have him order me about like some... Wilfrid sipped his scotch. Now I sincerely hope that one day you will come to your senses about the way you live. But I am not your keeper, Rowley. I reserve the right to be outraged, appalled, and utterly furious with you as the need arises. But what you do with Woodlands is your affair, and your affair alone. Roland said nothing, strangely shaken. You may also recall that you were the sole beneficiary of Uncle Roland's personal estate, however dubiously it was derived. Wilfrid continued, watching him closely. And you didn't think twice about having it consolidated into the Sinclair family trust. Let me be clear, Rowley. I will not tolerate you feeling beholden to me in any way. Roland's brow rose. It might be too late for that. I do not wish to ever talk about this again, Rowley. As I said, I would have rathered you never knew, but Arthur's bringing it up with you has raised an entirely different issue. Roland rubbed his face. What issue? Ray Mullins, as you know, passed away 10 years ago. I was the only other person to know the contents of this will, which has been kept here under lock and key. I didn't tell Arthur, but he was here, under this roof, while we were both in England last year. So he's been digging through your files? Roland asked. More than that, Rowley, Wilfrid said. You mentioned that the police have an anonymous informant who insists you were disinherited. Yes, that's what Delaney said. You suspect it's Arthur? Wilfrid nodded. I'm afraid so. But why would he? Wilfrid tapped the desk with his fingers distractedly. Perhaps he is angrier than he reveals about his own circumstances. Perhaps he wishes to punish us somehow, or perhaps he genuinely believes I killed Father. It doesn't really matter. Will, Roland said, recalling what Hugh Mackintosh had revealed. Do you know that Arthur made some unfortunate investments last year? Wilfrid's eyes narrowed. No, I didn't. I may need to ask the accountants to check our books for irregularities. I'm afraid I might have been too trusting where Arthur was concerned. Clearly the man is a Cowan. Exactly how much does the bastard know about our affairs? Roland asked. I don't know, Rowley. Roland told his brother about John Barrett's information. Wilfrid's face became harder. Could Arthur have found out about Hayden? Roland asked. Could he have tracked him down? Quite possibly. Arthur's a solicitor. He'd most likely know how to find a man. How long have you suspected him, Will? Obviously not long enough. It was this business about you being disinherited. Only someone with intimate access to and knowledge of our records would know there was ever an issue. Does Arthur know you've... No. I'm reasonably confident he believes that I supported his going to Sydney to keep you from breaking his nose. Wilfrid sighed. My most pressing problem is how I'm going to tell Kate that Lucy will have to find herself yet another Sinclair. Roland grimaced. He didn't envy his brother that. So what now, Will? I'll be in touch with the solicitors directly to inform them that our dear cousin Arthur is to have no further access or authority. And I'll telephone the Commissioner of Police to apprise him of the fact that his informant is none other than Arthur Sinclair, who has a vested interest in the outcome of your case, though to be honest I can't think what it is. Arthur doesn't want me convicted, Will, Roland replied, as he thought back to the confrontation with his cousin. I'm certain it's you he once held responsible. He thought of something then. If you were convicted, then your inheritance of Father's estate would be reversed, correct? Yes. And I was explicitly disinherited. To whom would the estate revert then? Wilfrid stared at him for a moment. He swore. Why the hell didn't I see it? Steady on. I'm not sure I see it yet. The residual clause. In Father's will, if the gift fails, the estate reverts to his brothers, or, if they are deceased, their male progeny. It was a similar clause that saw our father inherit Arthur's father's estate. But Arthur was disinherited. By his father. It doesn't affect our father's will. And Arthur would know this? He's a solicitor, Rowley. We can probably assume he's as underhanded, mean-spirited, and amoral as the best of his profession. Which means we have to be more concerned about proving your innocence than mine. Possibly not. The solicitors have already warned me that if you're convicted, I could easily be prosecuted as an accessory after the fact. And would that preclude you from inheriting? Wilfrid paused.
I don't know. I'll have to ask them. He sighed. Now to the other matter at hand. Tell me what precipitated Mother becoming so suddenly unwell.
Roland frowned, confessing his reckless demands on his mother's memory. I'm so sorry, Will. For a moment I really thought she might remember me. Wilfrid removed his glasses and polished them vigorously as he studied his brother.
It probably wasn't you, Rowley. Mother is getting worse, more fragile and difficult to deal with. She's lashed out at the servants and even Kate on a couple of occasions now. I was consulting doctors about Mother, not you.
Roland regarded his brother with both sympathy and horror.
God, Will, you're not considering a sanatorium? I don't know, Rowley. Perhaps engaging the services of a private nurse will suffice.
What did the doctors say?
Nothing particularly useful.
Wilfrid regarded Roland gravely.
Look, Rowley, the immediate issue is that your presence is upsetting Mother. Perhaps she is finally beginning to realize you're not Aubrey.
Roland stared moodily at his drink. Wilfrid continued.
I thought it might be a good time for you to take a little sojourn.
Roland looked up. Where?
To Melbourne. Kew, to be exact.
Wilfrid handed Roland a sealed envelope.
A letter of introduction to the Honourable Robert Menzies, KC, with a reminder that he is unlikely to move into federal politics without my support.
You want me to personally deliver a threat?
Roland asked. Don't you think that's a trifle? I want you to find out exactly what he was doing on the night of Father's death, in the time I left him unattended in the drawing room.
Gilby and Angel call in every second day, Will. If they find I'm not here.
What if you take the plane? Could you fly there and back in 24 hours?
Yes, of course. If I could find a place to land, Doris. I can't exactly park her in front of his house.
Leave that to me.
Roland opened the shed doors on Emo Ruo half an hour after Gilby and Angel left the property, having once again confirmed he had not fled. Clyde insisted on checking over the Rule Britannia, his caution justified by the discovery of an issue with the pushrods.
This might have brought down the aeroplane, Clyde grumbled as he attended to the problem, which fortunately was relatively simple to remedy.
We checked the pushrods after I took her up last time, Roland said, perplexed.
Do you suppose someone's been tampering with the plane?
Clyde asked, wiping the grease off his hands.
Roland shrugged. It's more likely we missed something.
Perhaps.
Clyde's manner made it clear that he did not think it more likely at all.
Roland climbed up onto the wing and pulled the extra cap and goggles from the cockpit.
Though he had initially resisted involving his friend in the current escapade, Clyde had insisted. With Milton and Edna backing Clyde, Roland had given in. No one had come to see them off. Indeed, very few people knew they were going. Roland had taken to his bed the day before with what the helpful Maguire proclaimed was flu. Kate, in her delicate condition, was banned from that part of the house, as were the servants and the rest of the household. Roland was purportedly being tended by a specialist nurse and Maguire himself. Edna and Milton, who might otherwise have been likely to risk contagion, were party to the ruse, and so did nothing to challenge or breach the quarantine. When the detectives had arrived that morning, Roland had spoken to them from his sickbed, coughing and spluttering in what was quite a reasonable impersonation of a man who was seriously unwell. Clyde had left the house on the pretext of catching the train to Batlow via Cootamundra. Wilfrid allowed him to take one of the farm vehicles. Roland had been secreted on the payload. And so to everyone whom the police might question, Roland Sinclair lay ill in his bed, while Clyde Watson-Jones was visiting his mother. They parked the Chevrolet Capital in the shed and taxied the Rule Britannia out into the paddock. The weather was fair, the sky clear, and the winds ideal in both strength and direction. The Gypsy Moth took off into the nor'easterly without incident and turned south for the hop to Melbourne, with a refuelling stop at Wangaratta. Finding Eldon Vale, where Wilfrid had arranged for them to land, was not difficult from the air. Both Roland and Clyde had charted their route carefully. following the railway lines and then the Yarra River. The house was distinctive, boasting turrets and spires in the style of a European castle. A short runway had been cut into the natural bushland behind the tennis courts. Rule Britannia approached from the south, touching down surprisingly softly before slowing to a gentle stop.
"Hello, it's the cavalry,"
Clyde said as several riders on horseback charged towards them. He and Roland climbed out of the cockpit and dropped onto the tarred ground.
Well, you must be young Rolly Sinclair."
A gentleman in hunting pinks slipped down from the lead horse to shake Roland's hand. He spoke with a distinct Highland brogue. "Colonel Muat?" Roland regarded his brother's old friend and comrade curiously. Gregory Muat had apparently been Wilfrid's commanding officer during the war. He was a compact, affable sort of chap who grinned broadly at them both through a neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard. Roland wasn't entirely sure how much Muat knew about their current purpose.
"Colonel, good heavens, laddie. Nobody's called me that since the war."
He reached up and slapped Roland heartily on the back.
"I can't know who you mean unless you call me Haggis."
"I beg your pardon?"
"Haggis. All the lads call me Haggis."
He laughed loudly to demonstrate his approval of the joke. "Yes, of course. Haggis." The other riders dismounted now, and Muat introduced his wife, a tall blonde he called Apples for some reason he did not specify. Roland elected to call her Mrs. Muat.
"Wilf was at pains to point out that you'll be in a tearing hurry, so I have a car waiting. There's a driver too, if you want him, but I see you've brought your own,"
Muat said, nodding at Clyde. The Muats left their horses with the other riders and walked Roland and Clyde past the tennis courts to a gleaming Cadillac parked in the drive.
"We had hoped to be slightly less conspicuous, sir,"
Clyde ventured hesitantly.
"My good man, you're going to queue. Anything but the latest limousine will be highly conspicuous. I can tell you that."
"We do wish we could stop to take a drink with you before you go,"
Mrs. Muat apologized.
"But if we don't get back into the chase, we'll never catch the hounds, and the lads will get away."
"The lads?" Roland couldn't help but ask. It seemed rather a friendly term by which to refer to foxes.
"Young Tom and Samuel," Mrs. Muat said. "Our eldest is abroad, so it's just the bairns."
"You're hunting your sons?"
"Oh, aye. Haggis, daft as he is, won't kill anything but Germans, but the hounds will follow the lads, you see. You wouldn't know it wasn't a real hunt."
Muat concurred with his wife.
"Our Tom's become quite swift. Could run for Australia, that lad."
Roland glanced at Clyde, who was clearly bemused. "We'd best not keep you, then. Thank you kindly for your help and your hospitality, Mrs. Muat, Mr. Haggis."
"Not at all, laddie. Only too glad to do old Wilf a good turn."
Muat checked his watch.
"I've made an appointment for you with Dag Menzies. He may be under the impression you're a delegate from the Graziers Association. Plenty of votes in that. I'll see that your bird's refuelled and ready to go once we catch the lads."
Chapter 29. The Presbyterian Church, Cotham Road, looked beautiful with its decorations of Arium lilies and white roses, done by the ladies of the congregation in honour of the marriage of Miss Patty May Lecky, oldest daughter of Mr. John W. Lecky, ex-MHR for Indy, Manningtree Road, Hawthorne, to Mr. Robert Gordon Menzies, third son of Mr. James Menzies, MLA, which was celebrated on Monday evening, September 27th, by the Reverend J. H. Anderson. The graceful bride, who was given away by her father, wore a beautiful gown of ivory satin, made with pannier draperies, held with clusters of exquisite handmade silver flowers, and a softly folded corsage with georgette sleeves. The bridesmaids were the Misses Corin and Gwyneth Lecky, sisters of the bride, and Miss Ruth Gossman. The reception was held at the Grand Hotel, the guests being received by Mr. and Mrs. Lecky, stepmother of the bride. Alexandra and Ye Standard, 22nd October, 1920. Not yet 40, the Deputy Premier of Victoria was still a young man, but already he looked every inch a statesman. He moved and spoke with a careful gravity, and received Roland with the friendly formality of the political stage. Clyde, as Roland's driver, had remained with the car. They had decided on the journey from Eldonvale that Menzies may be more forthcoming to Roland alone. Roland waited until they were in Menzies' study with the door closed before he informed the Deputy Premier that he had nothing to do with the Grazes Association. Menzies stood alarmed. Roland handed him Wilfrid's letter before Menzies called for help. He scanned it hastily and then sat down in the leather-upholstered captain's chair behind his desk. "Please do sit down, Mr. Sinclair." Roland took the armchair facing the desk. The study was not much different in style from Wilfrid's, conservative, ordered, and quietly opulent. "Your brother, with whom I have had a long-standing acquaintance, believes there is a matter with which I can help you. I'll do my best, of course, but I must tell you I don't often meet with clients personally at this stage of proceedings. It is more usual that a barrister is briefed by advising solicitors." "It's not your professional assistance I require, Mr. Menzies." "I see. I don't know if you recall, sir, but you visited my family property, Oakley, in early 1920 to meet with my brother." "To be precise, Mr. Sinclair, I stopped in for a quick drink after I'd met with your brother at his club in town." "You remember it, then?" "I may." Menzies remained cautious. "Will tells me that he was forced to leave you alone in the drawing-room whilst he dealt with an incident demanding his immediate attention." Menzies' eyes glinted suspiciously from beneath dark, unswept brows. Yes, I believe he might have, but I wasn't alone." "I beg your pardon, sir?" "Wilfrid was gone for quite a long time, as I recall. Mrs. Sinclair, your charming mother, kept me company." "My mother? She was in the drawing-room?" "She came down shortly after Wilfrid left to attend whatever business called him away. I'm afraid Mrs. Sinclair was rather cross that Wilfrid would have abandoned a guest in her house and insisted on keeping me company." "You were with my mother all that time?" Roland asked, surprised. "Will said he was gone for hours." "Perhaps 2, Menzies agreed. "Mrs. Sinclair was fortunately a gracious and vibrant conversationalist. At her insistence, we shared a bottle of your father's finest cognac and talked about your late brother." "Aubrey?" Menzies sighed. "It seems your brother and I were the same age. Your dear mother did not want him to go to war. Like my own mother, she felt her elder son was sacrifice enough." "Both my brothers served," Roland said. "Aubrey died in France." "My brothers served also. Fortunately, they both came back. My mother was successful in keeping me out of service, a fact which my political enemies have always been eager to exploit. But it seems your father insisted that Aubrey do his duty." Roland frowned. He remembered only that his brothers had all enlisted. He had not thought about whether they wanted to go. He'd always assumed they did. "I see. But Will didn't see Mother there with you when he—" "I'm afraid she became distressed. The talk of Aubrey, I suppose. She excused herself shortly before your brother returned. I was about to leave when Wilfrid appeared and offered me another drink." "And then you heard the gunshot which killed my father." A cold realization spread from the pit of Roland's stomach. "At the time, I was aware only that it was a gunshot," Menzies said, his posture defensive. "For all I knew, it might have been one of the workmen shooting at a fox." "That would be unusual inside the house, don't you think?" "I suppose, in hindsight. Wilfrid left for a couple of minutes and then returned to suggest it might be politic to leave before I became unwittingly embroiled in an unsavoury affair that might be used by my legal adversaries of the time to discredit me." "I don't suppose you recall seeing anyone else in the house while you were there, sir?" "The housekeeper when we first came in, but otherwise no." Roland bit his lip uneasily. "I understand," Menzies said hesitantly into the silence, "that your father was murdered by an intruder that evening." "Yes, sir. I'm afraid the culprit was never found." "My sympathies, Mr. Sinclair, and to your good mother. May I ask, sir, why you are looking into this tragic matter now?" "The gun used to kill my father has only recently been found and retrieved," Roland replied. "We hoped it might lead to some resolution." He stood. "Thank you, Mr. Menzies. I do appreciate your time." Menzies walked Roland to the door. It was as they shook hands in the vestibule that Mrs. Menzies came out in search of her husband. Bob Menzies introduced Roland to his wife.
"Roland is Wilfred Sinclair's younger brother, Patty."
"Of course. I'd have recognized those glorious blue Sinclair eyes anywhere," Patty Menzies said, smiling. "How is Wilfred?" "He's well, Mrs. Menzies. About to become a father again." Patty Menzies laughed. "It's hard to imagine Wilfred as a father. He was such a rogue."
Roland's brow rose. Rogue was not a word he would ever have associated with Wilfred.
"Now, my dear," Menzies said sternly, "we mustn't slander the man to his own brother." With not a little curiosity, Roland regarded the woman Wilfred had once sought to marry. She stood by Menzies with a kind of complimentary confidence he'd never seen in shy Kate Sinclair. His sister-in-law had always seemed uncertain of her place. Patty asked after Kate, whom it seemed she looked forward to meeting when Bob made the move to Canberra. The Deputy Premier's wife was a perfect hostess, warm and charming, with not a word or gesture out of place. The ideal partner for a man in pursuit of power. And yet Wilfred had fallen in love with a slip of a girl. Roland was glad. He was very fond of Kate and always charmed by how unreservedly beguiled Wilfred was with his young wife. After a courteous sufficiency of pleasantries had been exchanged, Roland took his leave of Mr. and Mrs. Menzies and returned to the Cadillac, which awaited him in the drive. "Well?" Clyde asked once the Menzies' house was well behind them. Roland stared silently at the road ahead. "Did you discover anything?" Clyde persisted. Roland groaned. "Yes." "Brilliant!" "Actually, no. It isn't." Clyde glanced at his friend. Roland looked wretched. "Rolly? Are you all right, mate?" Roland dropped his head back against the seat. He rubbed his face and spoke candidly, trusting Clyde to guard his confidence. "I think my mother might have shot him, Clyde." "What? Why?" Roland recounted his conversation with Robert Menzies. "But your mother, Rolly." Clyde pulled the car over to the side of the road and switched off the engine. "Why would she want to kill your father? It doesn't make sense." Roland closed his eyes. "She was terrified of him, Clyde." "Did he—" "I'm not sure. I didn't ever see him raise a hand against her, but I was at school during the term." "And when he'd lay into you, or get Hayden to?" "She'd lock herself in her room. The next morning we'd both pretend it hadn't happened." Roland spoke quietly. He felt strangely ashamed. "Mother didn't have a lot to do with me after Aubrey died anyway. Not until I returned from England, when she decided I was Aubrey." "Well, if she was so scared of your father, and so indifferent to what was happening to you, why would she suddenly find the courage to brandish a gun and shoot the bastard?" "Maybe she wasn't as indifferent as she seemed," Roland said wistfully. "Or perhaps she blamed my father for insisting Aubrey enlist." He smiled sadly. "Most likely it was the bottle of cognac she shared with Menzies. The thing is, Clyde, it makes more sense than anything else." "But what about Hayden?" Clyde said. "You don't believe your mother made her way to Emo Ruo and beat him to death, do you?" "Well, no. That would be utterly absurd. Someone else killed Hayden." Clyde watched Roland carefully. "Do you know who?" "No, but—" He bit his lip anxiously. "We should get back. I need to talk to Will." Clyde started the car. If what Roland suspected proved correct, it was the worst possible news for many reasons. Aside from the tragedy of it, Roland's best chance of clearing his own name was to find and expose the actual killer. But he was unlikely to offer his mother to the detectives as an alternative. "Don't worry, mate," Clyde said, glancing sideways at Roland.
We'll think of something." By the time they returned to Eldon Vale, the Muats had managed to hunt down their sons.
"This has to be the oddest bloody thing I've seen your lot get up to,"
Clyde whispered as Muat recounted the number of fences they'd needed to jump to be there at the kill. Roland smiled. "It's the same as a drag hunt in principle, I guess. It's the fact that they don't want to actually kill things that's unusual." True to his word, Muat had refueled the Rule Britannia. Given the earlier trouble with the pushrods, Clyde and Roland ran a particularly careful check on the workings of the gypsy moth. Finding nothing untoward, they prepared to leave. Mrs. Muat presented them with a large basket containing sandwiches, an apple pie, a flask of tea, a white linen tablecloth, napery, and 2 silver candlesticks. Roland thanked her, though he was unsure why and where she thought he and Clyde would stop for so elegant a picnic. He helped himself to a corned beef sandwich before he climbed into the cockpit and left the remainder of the basket to his passenger. The day was still relatively clear, though wispy cloud was accumulating to the north. Roland switched on the fuel and waited while Clyde swung the propeller until the engine kicked over, removed the chocks, and climbed into the passenger seat. The Muats stood by the runway to wave them off. By the time they took off from Wangaratta, after refueling, the weather had come in. The valiant gypsy moth fought strong headwinds all the way back to Yass. Roland had never before flown in such difficult conditions. The ply and canvas body of the Rule Britannia creaked and strained against the battering squalls. They did not make good time at all, and it was nearly completely dark by the time they reached the Yass Shire. Roland cursed, trying to keep calm. He did not see how he could land at Oakley in the dark, but they were very low on fuel now, and diverting was not an option. The weather was only making the situation more grim. It was then he saw the lights, 2 rows distinctly visible through the rain, marking a runway of sorts. He throttled back the engine and began his descent. They landed hard, bouncing as Roland struggled to keep the wheels even and the nose up. The Rule Britannia slipped and fishtailed dangerously. Someone pressed a car horn, and then finally she stopped. Roland took his hand off the joystick, gasping, relieved. He turned to check that his passenger was all right. Clyde looked shaken and wet, but otherwise he seemed intact.
"Rolly!"
Harry Simpson ran up to the plane. Roland climbed out, dragging off his cap and goggles.
"Harry, what are you doing here? When the weather turned, Will thought you might need some help."
Simpson shouted over the engines of the dozen vehicles, an assortment of trucks, and even Wilfred's Rolls-Royce Continental, which idled in the paddock with their headlamps on.
"We rounded up all the motors on the property and a few hurricane lamps and hoped you'd land before too long."
"We may have to fire up the Caterpillar to get everyone out," Roland said, as he and Clyde trudged through the mud after Simpson. Simpson opened the door of one of the trucks and indicated they should get in.
"That's not the worst of our problems, Rolly. Delaney rang. Some bastard tipped up the police that you'd breached your bail conditions. Gilby and Angel are on their way to Oakley. They may be there already. We've got to get you back."
Roland swore. A breach would see him return to Long Bay until trial.
"Who tipped off the police?"
he asked as Simpson put the truck into gear.
"Anonymous, apparently."
The police cars were already parked in the drive when they reached Oakley. Simpson took the farm truck to the back of the house. "We'll just say I was out inspecting sheep with you," Roland said to Simpson.
"Rolly nobody inspects sheep in the rain."
"They won't know that. We've been inspecting sheep all day and got caught in the rain."
"What exactly were you inspecting them for?" Simpson asked, shaking his head.
"I don't know. Condition, colour, the length of their skirts. Make something up."
"I can't go in," Simpson said, stopping. "Tell them where to find me, and I'll tell them about sheep."
Roland didn't argue.
"Oh, Rolly, thank goodness you're here."
Edna ran out of the door to intercept them.
"You can't come in, the police are here."
"I know."
"Wilfred and Dr. Maguire have already told them you're in your room dangerously ill. They're arguing on the staircase right now. You can't just walk in from outside."
"Is there any way of getting to your room without using the main staircase?" Clyde asked. Roland sighed. "Not through the house. I'll have to climb up through the window."
"Are you mad? It's on the second story."
"I had that room when I was a boy," Roland smiled. "Believe me, I've climbed in and out that way often." He loosened his tie. "I'll need a couple of minutes." Edna nodded.
"I'll see if I can help Wilfrid and Dr. Maguire convince them you're contagious."
She turned to Clyde and Simpson.
"Can you gentlemen please see that he doesn't break his neck?"
Roland was already on his way to the window. He assessed the task. The tree and the drain-pipe he'd always used as a boy were still there. The lattice looked distinctly more rickety than he remembered, but he presumed the wisteria vine had strengthened to compensate. He was lucky, he supposed, that Edna Walling had not decided to remove it. He handed his jacket to Clyde, rolled up his sleeves, and began. The apricot tree helped him scale the ground floor quite easily. The next story was more difficult. The drain-pipe was wet, as was the vine. Still, somehow, he made it to the ledge of his window. He'd disabled the latch himself when he was 12, and to his relief it had not been repaired. Even so, opening the window was tricky, as it required him to take all his weight with one arm whilst he pushed the window up. The trellis cracked beneath his right foot, and for a moment he slipped. Clyde swore. Roland scrambled, regaining his footing on the wisteria and dragging himself up through the open window. He was reminded that he had grown a fair bit since he'd last tried this. He could hear Will and Maguire arguing with the detectives in the hallway. Roland ripped off his clothes and bundled them into the cupboard before throwing on his robe. He opened the door to the room and stepped out.
"What is going on out here? How's a man to get any sleep?" he demanded.
The four men quarrelling in the hallway fell silent and stared at him.
"Mr. Sinclair, how are you feeling?"
Maguire asked eventually.
"Bloody awful,"
Roland replied, coughing violently.
"He's wet,"
Gilby said suspiciously.
"He's soaking wet."
"That, you fool, would be the fever," Maguire said curtly.
"Come on, Mr. Sinclair, we'd best get you back to bed before you have a complete relapse."
He turned to Gilby and Angel. "If you're satisfied, gentlemen, Mr. Sinclair is a very unwell man and should not be on his feet." He ushered Roland back into the bedroom and slammed the door. Chapter 30. Good Manners at Home. Practical jokes are rarely indulged in by persons of nice perceptions, and teasing passes the bounds of good taste when it ceases to be a matter of pure fun from all sides. Inquisitiveness is always bad form. Whom is your letter from? What makes your eyes so red? Are interferences with one's rightful privacy. A closed door should be respected and give assurance of seclusion. Camperdown Chronicle, 1933. Roland inspected his jaw in the shaving mirror before finally rinsing his razor in the porcelain basin of his washstand. He glanced out of the window and saw that the police cars were no longer parked in the drive. Toweling off his face, he selected a tie, relieved he no longer had to feign being mortally ill. He tied the Windsor knot with expert and practiced speed and grabbed a clean jacket from the wardrobe. Ernest was outside his door when he opened it to go down.
"Uncle Rowley, you're back."
"I was never away, just a mite unwell."
"Yes, you were away,"
Ernest accused.
"You weren't here."
Roland knelt to look his nephew in the face. "You're right, Ernie, but that was a secret. How did you know I wasn't here?"
"I came to see you, and I waited and waited and waited, and then I let myself into your room."
"Did you indeed?" Wilfrid said reprovingly as he entered the hallway. Ernest stepped back and bit his lip. "Ernie, what have I told you about respecting people's privacy?" Wilfrid said, folding his arms as he looked down at his son. "You were told to stay out of your uncle's room." Ernest's lower lip wobbled under his father's censorious gaze.
"I wanted to give him the picture."
"What picture?"
"I made Uncle Rowley a picture of Lenin and me to help him feel better, but he wasn't there."
"I'm sorry I wasn't there, mate," Roland said, still kneeling. "I had an errand to run."
"When you were sick?"
"I felt a bit better, so I ducked out." "Ernie, did you tell anyone I wasn't here?"
"I told Mr. Isaacs. He said that sometimes you like to sleep under the bed, but that he was sure you were there and would I like to play cricket."
"I see. Did you tell anyone else?"
"Only Aunt Lucy."
At this, the Sinclair brothers exchanged a glance.
"She telephoned, and I spoke to her while Mrs. Kendall fetched Mummy. Aunt Lucy asked about you, Uncle Rowley, and where you were, and I told her you weren't under the bed because I went back and checked."
Ernest looked very much like he was about to cry now. Roland smiled. "I don't sleep under the bed, Ernie. I don't know where Mr. Isaacs gets such preposterous ideas. Perhaps we should go have words with him for pulling your leg so abominably." Ernest nodded. "I think that first you and I need to have a word about obedience and discretion, Ernest," Wilfred said, taking his son by the shoulders and turning him firmly in the opposite direction. "You go to your room and wait for me. I'll be there directly." Roland stood as they watched Ernest dawdle away. His shoulders slumped and his head hung as if he were walking to the gallows. Roland looked at his brother uneasily. "Will, he didn't mean—"
"If you'd really been sick, Crowley, he might have endangered himself by going into your room when he'd been told not to."
"But, Will, you're not planning to—"
"Rowley," Wilfred interrupted, sighing, "I have never had cause, and hope never to have cause, to discipline my sons with anything more severe than a cross talking to. Ernie has a flair for the dramatic, and he's worked out that you're a soft touch." He shook his head. "I shudder to think what lawless brats you'll raise one day." Nobody commented on Roland's sudden and almost miraculous recovery. Even Kate let it pass without comment. She possibly realized that there was more to it, but Kate had always trusted that her husband would tell her what she needed to know about his machinations, and the rest was best left alone. Wilfred came down with Ernest a few minutes later. The boy held his father's hand as he apologized to Roland.
"I'm sorry I invaded your piracy, Uncle Rowley."
Roland smiled. "Privacy, Ernie. I haven't plundered the coastline in a while." Ernest nodded solemnly.
"I'll never come in without knocking again."
"Without knocking and being invited in,"
Wilfred corrected, in case Ernest was creating a loophole for himself. Roland winked at his nephew. "That's good of you, old chap." Ernest handed him a sheet of paper. It was the picture for which he had risked disobeying his father. Roland smiled as he studied the drawing. Ernest had never drawn for him before, preferring to watch as Roland sketched. The picture was full of whimsy and vibrance, naive attention to some detail, and the complete disregard of others. Lenin had been faithfully represented with only one ear, and numerous scars, though it seemed he was the size of a pony.
"Do you like it, Uncle Rowley?"
"Very much."
"Will you put it on your wall?"
"I will indeed. I'll hang it proudly alongside the Picasso."
"What's a Picasso?"
"Picasso. He's a very famous artist who's devoted his life to trying to draw like this."
"Do you think I could be a famous artist too, Uncle Rowley?"
Wilfred cleared his throat, clearly alarmed by the thought.
"I believe that's Mrs. Kendall calling you for bed, son. You'd best run along now."
Ernest beckoned Roland down and whispered in his ear,
"I'm glad you're not really going to die, Uncle Rowley."
Roland met the child's wide eyes, startled. Ernest had obviously taken his uncle's supposed illness more seriously than they'd anticipated. "I'm sorry I worried you, mate."
"That's all right, Uncle Rowley."
Ernest regarded Roland gravely.
"You shouldn't go out in the rain, though. You'll catch death."
"I'm afraid I forgot how impressionable Ernie is," Wilfred said as the boy trotted off. "He's become very fond of you, Rowley, and his imagination is, 6 years old. I'm afraid he was convinced you'd contracted some fatal disease."
"To be fair, we did go to some lengths to create that impression," Roland reminded him.
"Yes, I suppose we did."
He removed his spectacles and extracted a handkerchief with which to polish them.
"So did you manage to speak to Bob Menzies?"
Roland nodded.
"And?"
"We should talk." Wilfred frowned.
"Come into the library where we won't be disturbed."
In the privacy of the library, Roland told his brother in some detail of his conversation with Robert Menzies. Wilfred swore, obviously drawing the same conclusion that Roland had. "Did father insist that Aubrey enlist?" Roland asked.
"Yes, but he also insisted I enlist. That was father. He never spoke without insisting or demanding. Aubrey would have joined anyway. We all thought it would be over by Christmas. He never thought he'd die. But Mother was always particularly protective of Aubrey, and he was only 19 when he went." Wilfrid was lost in his own thoughts for a moment. "I didn't even think to wonder where she was that night." "Will, did he ever strike Mother?" Roland struggled with the question because he dreaded the answer. Wilfrid's eyes darkened and he spoke candidly. "Yes. They used to quarrel, mostly about Harry. He'd take a belt to her, until Aubrey and I were old enough to intervene." "Did no one else try to do anything?" "Uncle Roland did. He tried to reason with Father on several occasions, but it isn't the kind of thing people talk about." Roland clenched his fists, frustrated. "I can't remember." "You were younger then than Ernie is now, Rowley. Harry's mother passed away around that time, and after that Mother and Father didn't quarrel so much." He sighed. "When we went to war, we really thought it would be all right, for Mother and you. Father had been content to disinherit us now and then for years. We didn't think he'd... I can't tell you how sorry I am." "What could you have done, Will?" Roland replied bitterly. "Short of shooting him before you left." He stared absently into the distance. "Do you suppose he'd started to batter her again?" "Perhaps she was simply in terror that he would," Wilfrid said gently. "Or perhaps she was trying to protect you in her way." Roland swallowed. "Do you think she remembers, Will? Do you think she's starting to remember?" Wilfrid rubbed his temple wearily. "I'm not certain. How could we ever be certain of what's going on in Mother's mind? The nurse informed me this morning that some of the laudanum Maguire prescribed is missing." "Laudanum? Who would—" "I can't imagine any of the servants would steal laudanum. The nurse fears it was Mother herself." "I don't understand." "Maguire suspects Mother may be more depressed than we know. If she's remembering, realizing, we're just keeping a very close eye on her." Roland stared at his brother. "My God! What are we going to do, Will?" "If this gets worse, we may be forced to consider a sanatorium. I wouldn't make that decision without you, Rowley, but you should be prepared for the fact that we may have no other option." Roland groaned. "What about the police? We can't—" "I'm not sure. I'll speak to our solicitors. Let's not panic just yet." Wilfrid lit a cigarette, and for a moment there was silence as he fortified himself with the first draw. "Perhaps we should concentrate on who killed Charlie Hayden," he suggested. "It was, after all, on the strength of Hayden's murder that they arrested you." Wilfrid sat back, tapping the arm of his chair absently, thoughtfully. "What do you remember from the scene?" Roland thought back. "Hayden had a belt in his hand," he said. "A belt?" Roland nodded. "Like he was preparing to flog someone again." "At Imoruo? You don't think he'd taken a child to—" "What child? I'm sure I wasn't the only kid he took a belt to over the years, but he's not been back to the Yas district since you suggested he leave. Even if he came across a worker's son and decided to give him a hiding for some reason or another, what the hell would they be doing in Imoruo?" Wilfrid sighed. "Was there anything else unusual or worthy of note?" Roland paused. "Oh, Arthur. He was there with Lucy." "Of course. Arthur found the body." "So he says." "You're suggesting Arthur may have killed Hayden. Let's face facts, Will. He's deceived us from the beginning, plotted against you while living in your house. But murder? What possible reason could he have to murder Hayden?" "If he did find Hayden and bring him to Yas, perhaps Hayden was trying to blackmail him. Perhaps they fell out, or Hayden attacked him first." "Arthur's a solicitor, for pity's sake. Hayden was beaten to death." "Granted," Roland conceded. "It's not a particularly lawyerly way of dispatching someone. But from what I saw, it looked like Hayden had fallen and hit his head on the hearth. Someone was angry enough to hit him a few times, but they may not have intended to kill him entirely." "But Miss Bennet was with him, Rowley."
Miss Bennet questioned your 6-year-old son about my whereabouts and reported my absence to Arthur. I don't think there's any question where her allegiances lie. She telephoned to speak to Kate. It wasn't a conspiracy. She may have mentioned what Ernest told her to Arthur, but I doubt the poor girl has any idea what he's up to." Roland said nothing. "She's Kate's dearest friend," Wilfrid added. "And she's marrying the man who wants to have you incarcerated and assume ownership of Oakley. For heaven's sake, she's already started redecorating Woodlands." Wilfrid pressed his fingers together pensively. "I do hope you're wrong on that count, Rowley. Kate's making arrangements to go to Sydney to help Lucy plan this blasted wedding. Perhaps we should put our cards on the table, Will. Confront Arthur. What would that possibly achieve?" Roland wasn't sure. Lucy Bennet should know the kind of man she's marrying. "It's very gallant of you to be concerned about Miss Bennet," Wilfrid observed. "What can I say? I'm protective of the women who try to shoot me." Wilfrid sighed, abandoning the charade that some incompetent rabbit hunter had shot at his brother. He took another cigarette from the mahogany box on the table and stubbed out the remains of the first. "Perhaps it would be useful to acquaint Arthur with what it means to go to war against the Sinclairs." "Arthur is a Sinclair, Will," Roland reminded him. "Not once I'm finished." Chapter 31. Wronged Girls. There is also to be considered the fiction of the law which does not allow a girl to sue for seduction. She can only do so through her father or guardian, and to maintain an action it must be shown that the relationship of master and servant exists. Technically the action is by the father for the loss of his daughter's services, but if those services cannot be proved, the action fails. The Mercury, 3rd of March, 1934. Roland checked over his biplane, making sure she had been returned to the shed in good order. The Rule Britannia was a little muddy, but otherwise none the worse for landing in the storm. "We may have to give her a spit-shine," Clyde declared, inspecting the fuselage. "But considering how we landed, she's not too bad." Milton jumped down from the Caterpillar, parked on the other side of the shed. It too was caked in fresh red mud, having been called on to pull out a number of the vehicles that had been stranded after forming the makeshift airstrip. Edna wandered out of the shed, thoroughly bored with the talk of engines and machines. She could see the Emo Ruo homestead further up the hill. Roland joined her. "Shall we walk up?" he asked, glancing dubiously at the sky. It had stopped raining, but the clouds had not yet parted. "I'm sure we'll be all right," Edna said. She called out for Clyde and Milton to hurry. They had decided to take another look at the place where Charlie Hayden had been killed, in the hope that some new clue would present itself. It was not so much that Roland was convinced that his cousin had killed Hayden, but his mind was open to the possibility. He unlocked the front door and held it open for Edna to enter. "Whose furniture is this?" Edna asked, peering under the dust-cloths. "I presume the previous owners. They sold the place lock, stock, and barrel to Will." "Everything?" Edna asked. "I believe Jeffries hanged himself. After that, his wife just wanted to leave. There was a colossal amount of debt." "Oh, how terribly sad. They lost everything." Roland nodded. "Pretty close, too." They followed Clyde and Milton into the room where Hayden had been found. The body had been removed, of course, but otherwise the room was undisturbed. They inspected it in the light of day. The blood was still visible, dried brown on the hearth and the rug adjacent. In these surrounds, an image of Hayden's body was easily conjured. Roland described what he could remember for Edna. "Look how far into the room he was standing," Edna mused. "If someone had come in suddenly, surely he would have turned and walked towards the door." Milton agreed. "He was meeting with someone. But why here? How did he get in?" "Perhaps whoever he was meeting possessed a key or knew where a spare was hidden," Edna suggested. Clyde stepped out the distance between the door and the hearth. "What do you think, Rowley? Arthur seemed pretty shaken when we got here. Perhaps it wasn't just because he found the body." Roland frowned. It would be easier to believe if Arthur didn't have Lucy Bennet with him. Surely if you were going to kill someone, you wouldn't take a witness. Unless he didn't plan to kill Hayden. Perhaps something happened that made Arthur panic and hit him. Maybe he was trying to prevent Hayden revealing their association to Lucy, Edna suggested. He does seem genuinely keen on her. The belt, Milton said. That's why the police thought immediately it was you. Clyde looked Roland up and down. He'd be a bloody idiot to try to take a belt to Rowley now, he said. Yes, Milton continued. But maybe someone wanted to point the police in Rowley's direction. Surely it wouldn't be difficult to remove a dead man's belt and place it in his hand. Roland shook his head. He had it wrapped around his hand in exactly the same way. Arthur was there when Hayden told his story, Clyde reminded him. He knew exactly what the mongrel did and how he did it. Roland considered the poet's theory. It's possible. But I genuinely can't see Lucy going along with it. She's much more likely to have screamed the place down. Milton shrugged. Perhaps she didn't see him do it. She might have been waiting dutifully in the car. Did you ask her what she saw? No. She hasn't really spoken more than a few words to me since I refused to marry her. Well, we may have to talk to her, Milton said firmly. Wilfred's arranged for Arthur and his fiancée to come to luncheon at Oakley tomorrow, Roland replied. Thought it might be a little tricky separating them. Edna laughed.
Oh, nonsense. You Sinclairs clear the room of women whenever you're afraid you may swear. She winked at Roland. You announce that you wish to speak frankly, and everyone will gasp and agree that it's better if Lucy visits with Kate for a while. We'll speak to her then.
Roland wished he could accuse the sculptress of exaggerating, but to be honest, it was as good a plan as any. There was a garden party at Oakley that afternoon, hosted by Mr. and Mrs. Wilfrid Sinclair, to thank all those who had helped extinguish the fire. 2 marquees had been erected on the lawns. A 10-piece band used the veranda as a makeshift stage overlooking a portable parquetry dance floor, specially laid for the event. White-clothed tables bore a feast of prettily iced cakes, finger sandwiches, and cold meats on tiered silver platters as workers and townspeople in their Sunday best arrived to receive the gratitude of the Sinclairs. Kate stood by her husband's side, shaking hands and welcoming guests. In the shadow of Wilfrid's powerful and protective presence, she seemed small despite the fullness of her belly. Roland smiled as he watched Wilfrid whisper in Kate's ear, gently moving her hair out of the way. The gesture was perfectly proper, but intimate and tender nevertheless. Kate blushed, and Wilfrid carried on with the business of shaking hands. Deciding that they should not cause any more disruption at Oakley than absolutely necessary, Edna had bullied Milton into one of Roland's suits for the occasion. Initially, the poet resisted the 3-piece uniform of the capitalist establishment, but eventually he conceded, making the best of it by adopting what he considered a complimentary persona. He proved quite a popular figure, reciting poetry with the refined lilt of someone who regularly moved in the same circles as Wilfrid Sinclair. "Do you recognise the bloke Milt's talking to?" Clyde asked, handing Roland a drink. "I believe that's Dave Jessup. He's one of the blokes that tried to tar and feather Milt a couple of years ago, isn't he?" Roland sipped his drink. "I'd say at least half the chaps here were among the mob that tried to tar and feather Milt. And yet not one of them seems to recognise him. Small mercies." Wilfrid stood on the elevated deck of the gazebo to deliver a few words of thanks. With Ernest holding tightly to his hand, he spoke of his gratitude to all those who had risked their lives to save Oakley, his sons, and their nanny. His words were greeted with enthusiastic applause and echoed with shouts of "Hear, hear," and calls for cheers. That formality completed, the band struck up again and the festivities resumed. This was not the usual crowd who graced Sinclair functions, but a more eclectic gathering of farm workers, firefighters, and neighbours. The guests seemed, to Roland, a touch inhibited, perhaps intimidated. He offered Edna his hand. "Shall we begin the dancing?" he said, glancing at the empty dance floor. She curtsied. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Sinclair." The sculptress slipped easily into his arms, as she always had, and they christened the new dance floor with a quick step. Soon other couples joined them, and the gathering seemed to relax. Roland managed to keep Edna to himself for 3 brackets, but inevitably some young man worked up the courage to cut in. The party had been in swing for some hours when Roland ducked into the house to check on his mother. Elizabeth Sinclair watched the celebrations from her window, comfortably settled on a chaise with a cup of tea. Wilfrid had arranged for a nurse to be her companion at all times now. Roland stopped with his mother for a while, pointing out people with whom she might be acquainted in the crowd. He neither looked for nor made any attempt to remind her who he really was, unwilling to risk another breakdown.
"We hosted some very grand parties when your father was alive before the war. I had a blue gown I'd wear for balls. It was considered very daring in its day."
Roland listened, wondering how his refined, gracious mother could have been driven to murder, and how they were going to protect her without ending up in prison themselves. It was Elizabeth Sinclair who eventually urged him, or rather Aubrey, to return to the party, suggesting that he might meet a suitable young lady. He laughed, refilling her teacup and kissing her cheek before he left. Roland headed back outside through the kitchen so he could reassure Lenin, who had been confined there for the party, that he had not been forgotten. When he heard the scrabbling, he opened the door quickly, concerned the hound was helping himself to some painstakingly prepared culinary delicacy.
"Mr. Sinclair!"
Nanny de Waring sprang back from Jack Templeton, fumbling frantically with the pearl buttons of her blouse. Roland turned away while she made herself decent. She apologized hysterically. Roland did so out of courtesy.
"Charlotte, Mr. Waring is not to blame, Mr. Sinclair, sir," Templeton said gallantly. "It was me.
If you were forcing yourself upon Mr. Waring, Templeton, then you and I would have a problem. Otherwise, it's not really my concern."
"Oh, Mr. Sinclair,"
the young nanny sobbed, smoothing her hair back into place.
"If you can only forgive me, it won't happen again."
Roland smiled. "I'm neither your father nor your priest, Mr. Waring."
"This is my day off," she offered in mitigation. "There was no one in the kitchen and—"
"Not quite no one," Roland said, bending to rub Lenin behind the ear. The hound opened one eye and grunted. "But Len doesn't seem particularly scandalized. You could probably buy his silence with bacon."
"We got carried away, Mr. Sinclair," Templeton explained. "We didn't mean to—"
"This is a rather risky spot to get carried away, Mr. Templeton, don't you think? I'm sure there are more private, not to mention appropriate locations on Oakley for courting." Roland grimaced, wondering when he'd become so stuffy. Courting, for pity's sake. Perhaps Templeton sensed Roland Sinclair was having trouble being in any way critical.
"Do you have any recommendations, sir?"
he asked rather impudently. Charlotte de Waring blushed, but she didn't protest. Despite a vague notion that he should be offended, or at least disapproving, Roland laughed. "There's a folly on Imoruo near the creek. Looks like a Delphic temple. Some mad notion of the previous owners. It's a bit overgrown now. I don't think anyone's been there in years."
"You won't be requiring it yourself?"
Templeton asked, his eyes twinkling, in what Wilfrid would have considered an unacceptable show of familiarity. "No, I'm afraid not," Roland replied. Roland returned to the garden party, which by then was winding down. "Where have you been, Roly?" Edna asked. She was flushed with the consequential exertion of repeated invitations to dance. Roland told her quietly of the tryst upon which he'd stumbled. Edna giggled.
"Good Lord, they're lucky it was you and not Will."
Roland nodded. Wilfrid might well have objected, and quite strenuously, to his children's nanny entertaining the gardener in such a manner.
"The irresistibly handsome, mysterious gardener," Edna said dreamily. "It's all rather like Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover."
Roland's eyes sharpened.
"Templeton? You think he's mysterious?"
Edna smiled wickedly.
"Well, he's not nearly so mysterious as you, darling, but yes, I can see why he'd intrigue Nanny de Waring."
Chapter 32.
Success to Hitler. Reverend W. E. Hurst's wish. We wish, with our whole hearts, that Herr Hitler will be successful in the tremendous and revolutionary experiment which he is undertaking at the present time, and that he will succeed in bringing the world a little nearer to what our Lord intended it to be, a society of friends. These remarks were made by the Reverend W. E. Hurst, President of the Queensland branch of the Australian League of Nations Union, at a reception given by the branch to the commander, Captain Baron Harsdorff von Endendorf, and officers of the Karlsruhe at Mount Kutha on Saturday morning. The Reverend Mr. Hurst said he had been very much impressed with the remarks of Commander von Endendorf and First Officer Schiller in regard to Herr Hitler in an interview appearing in the press. The members of the branch greatly sympathized with Germany in the terrible and unjust conditions which had been imposed on her, and they wished Herr Hitler success in the task before him. Broken promises. There were a large number of persons in this country who felt that Germany had been treated very unfairly and unjustly by the world generally. Other nations gave a pledge that they would disarm to the extent they had forced Germany to do, and they had not done so. The present unrest in Europe, he believed, was mainly due to those broken promises. It had been said that all the trouble of the world today could be traced to the war. He refused to believe that. It was not right to impute war guilt to any one nation when there were others in it. Courier Mail, 16th of January, 1934.
Roland woke early. He'd slept fitfully. The last weeks since his father's gun had been found seemed to have halted the normal course of his life. He was frustrated, angry that his father had risen from the grave to cause more pain and misery. What Roland had seen in Germany still haunted him. The brutality of the Nazi regime, the administrative ruthlessness of it. Before the question of Henry Sinclair's death had been resurrected, he had been trying his level best to get someone to listen. Not successfully, of course. His concerns had been dismissed and belittled. At best he'd elicited a plea of powerlessness, but at least he'd been doing something. Roland showered and dressed quickly. He and Wilfrid would meet with their cousin and Lucy Bennett today. He wondered if Arthur had realized that his true intentions had been discovered. Perhaps not. Wilfrid had been playing their cards close. It seemed no one had yet come down to breakfast, and so rather than eat alone, Roland grabbed the newspaper from the sideboard and stepped out onto the veranda. The marquees had been taken down and all the lawns returned to their pristine manicured custom. From this part of the veranda the fire damage and consequent reconstruction work was not visible. In the distance, Roland could see Edna Walling pacing out distances while she made notes. Opening the paper, he wondered what the garden designer thought of all the drama at Oakley. Was she concerned that her clients could be murderers, or was that not as important as the harmony of the landscape she was creating? "Good morning," Milton joined him. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, dropping his elbows onto the rail beside Roland's. "Just wondering when this will all be over," Roland murmured. "April's a long time away, Milt. You and Clyde and Ed can't just put your own lives on hold for that long." "We can put our lives on hold long enough to see you cleared, mate." Roland handed him the paper, pointing out an article on the upcoming celebrations of the Nazis' first year in power in Germany, and another on the love of the German people for their Führer, which wished the German Chancellor every success. "With an indictment for murder over my head, I'll have no hope of persuading anyone Hitler's is a despicable regime." "You'll be acquitted, Rowley." "But it will always be there," he cursed. "Nobody seemed keen to listen to me anyway," he admitted, "not with so many eminent, upstanding citizens extolling the virtues of Hitler's Germany." For a while Milton studied him silently. "Do you remember Egon Kisch?" he asked finally. "Of course." Kisch had been one of the men who had given them refuge in Germany when they were wanted by the brown-shirts. "Egon's fled Germany. He's trying to spread the word about the reality under the Nazis. It's a shame we can't get him to come to Sydney." Milton looked intently at him. "It has been suggested." "Really? By whom?" Milton hesitated again. "The Australian chapter of the World Movement Against War and Fascism. They were established by Comintern, the Communist International. Roland was not surprised by his friend's reluctance. Milton was a communist, fervent and committed, but despite a certain sympathy, Roland Sinclair was not. Neither attempted to change the other, and whilst Milton had lived in his house, enjoyed his hospitality, and borrowed his clothes for years, he had never once asked Roland for money towards his cause. But this was different. It was Roland who asked. "What exactly are they proposing, Milt?"
"The movement wants to bring Egon out for some events at the end of the year to coincide with the centenary of Melbourne and the Royal Tour. They just need to fund it."
"Are you a member of this movement?"
"Yes."
"Will they let me join without being a communist?"
"Fellow travellers are always welcome," Milton replied, "particularly those with your resources. But are you sure you want to?"
"Egon might be able to convince people of what European fascism really means," Roland said, remembering how the journalist had persuaded his comrades to risk everything to help them. "Nothing that I'm doing is working. It's worth a try."
"Wilfrid won't like this."
"Doubtless, but I think it's a better investment than milk bars."
Milton pressed his shoulder. "I'll let them know."
This ends CD 8. CD 9.
Arthur Sinclair and Lucy Bennett arrived in her powder-blue Riley. Roland's friends retired discreetly to the conservatory with Ewan, who was in disgrace, having chewed his brother's toy plane into a woody pulp. Elizabeth Sinclair and her nurse, a sensible, quiet woman who was both firm and unobtrusive with her charge, sat in the sunshine embroidering. Kate waited with her husband and brother-in-law to receive the newly engaged couple in the drawing-room. If Arthur knew that his cousins had discovered his manoeuvres, he gave no indication of it, greeting them all with enthusiasm and jocularity. Kate greeted her old friend warmly.
"Oh, Kate, you're simply enormous," Lucy effused. "What do you think? Heir, mare, or spare? They say you can tell because girls steal beauty from their mothers."
She laughed.
"Must be a boy, then,"
Wilfrid said curtly. Kate blushed deeply.
"I might just speak to Mrs. Kendall about luncheon," she said, "if you'll all excuse me for just a moment."
Roland smiled. Any oblique compliment from Wilfrid seemed invariably to compel his sister-in-law to leave the room. It had always been thus. Roland imagined it had made courting her very awkward, and yet Wilfrid had managed it.
"I'll come too,"
Lucy called after Kate.
"It'll give us a chance to talk about the wedding while you gentlemen deal with business," she said,
smiling at her fiancé.
"I'm afraid there's been a terrible cock-up with the painters at Woodlands, Roland, old boy," Arthur said after Lucy had left. "Lucy and I called in there yesterday, and I'll be blowed if some fool hasn't painted the dining-room black. Black! It looks positively ghoulish. Some blasted tradesman trying to ensure he gets paid twice for the same job, I expect. But don't you worry, Lucy and I will sort it out when we get back. She's quite the little homemaker."
"Stay the hell out of my house," Roland said coldly.
"I beg your pardon?"
"We have become aware," Wilfrid said calmly, "that you, Arthur, have been acting as some kind of informant to the police."
"I see."
It seemed Arthur was not going to bother to deny it. He showed no sign of remorse or embarrassment.
"Well, how long did you expect to get away with murder, Wilfrid?"
"Neither Rowley nor I had anything to do with our father's death," Wilfrid replied, "so I hope you've not promised Miss Bennet the Sinclair estate in return for her hand."
"You deny it? Hardly a surprise."
Arthur rolled his eyes. "You've lived under Wilfrid's roof, eaten with his family, taken his charity," Roland snarled. "And the whole time you were—" Arthur snapped.
"Charity? A good part of this estate should always have been mine. Your conniving dictator of a father stole my inheritance."
"And so now you're seeking justice for him?"
Roland came back furiously.
"And to do that, you paid that vermin Charlie Hayden to come back to Yass?"
If the police had been doing their job, if Wilfrid hadn't run him out of town, they would have taken his statement years ago."
"I believe we've been fair to you, Arthur," Wilfrid said. "I settled your debts, gave you a new start.
A house. Yes, under obligation to the largesse of the great Wilfrid Sinclair for what should rightfully have been mine in the first place, Arthur hissed. I found Charlie Hayden's name in the ledgers. It was the fact that you'd sacked a long-serving employee so summarily the day after Uncle Henry was murdered that made me wonder. But it went rather wrong, didn't it, Arthur? Roland said, stepping towards his cousin. Hayden tried to blackmail you or pull out. He forced you to kill him. Me? Arthur poked Roland in the chest. How dare you try to pin your crimes on me? He was found at Imorua where you were about to set up house. You found his body. May I remind you that Miss Bennet was with me the entire time? She looked terribly distressed. Was that because she just witnessed you kill a man? Don't be bloody daft. The body was cold by the time we found it. I can't say I blame you for killing Hayden, all things considered, but don't think for 1 second that I'll take the blame. You and Wilfrid have it all worked out, don't you? He kills Uncle Harry, secures the entire estate for himself, and then keeps you and your useless, unemployed set in return for your silence. Look, you idiot! Will was with someone when Father was shot. He has an alibi, Roland blurted. For the first time, Arthur looked startled. What alibi? Who? Wilfrid placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Perhaps, Arthur, it would be best if you left. Lucy, of course, is welcome to stay. His eyes flashed fury, though his voice was steady. You will find all the lines of credit I arranged for you have been revoked. You are not welcome here, or at Woodlands. Do not expect any further consideration from the Sinclairs. I am a Sinclair, you bloody fool. We'll see. At that point, Kate and Lucy returned. Will! Kate stepped back, subconsciously repelled by the hostility in the room. Arthur is leaving, my dear. But why? Lucy demanded. What's happened? Because he's a duplicitous scoundrel, Roland replied, controlling his language with some effort. You're just jealous, Lucy said, moving to Arthur's side and entwining her arm in his. Roland laughed. He didn't mean to, but that particular accusation was more ridiculous than all the others which had been levelled at him of late. Lucy erupted. You, Roland Sinclair, are an amoral, spoiled, cruel child. You are not half the man your cousin is. Oh, Lucy, Kate said, shocked. I regret to inform you, Miss Bennet, Wilfrid said gravely, that your fiancé has been conspiring against us all the time he has been a guest in my house. He has violated our trust and any sense of honour. Because he wants to get back what's rightfully his? Lucy demanded. Because he wants to see justice done after all these years? Silence. Both stunned and appalled. None of them had really thought Lucy Bennet knew what Arthur had been up to. That she was complicit was something for which they were completely unprepared. Kate gasped. It was more a cry. Wilfrid moved immediately to help her into a chair. Lucy, you can't mean that, she pleaded. I believe Arthur, Lucy replied, unmoved by her friend's distress. I saw what Roland did to that poor man we found at Imorua, and I only thank God that I didn't accept him. I should have listened to Pater from the beginning. For pity's sake, Miss Bennet, you're the one that tried to shoot me, Roland said, exasperated. Lucy inhaled. Her horror and fury was tinged with panic. Arthur, darling, I should like to leave now, she said. Wilfrid took Kate up to bed and stayed with her, explaining and comforting his wife, who was deeply hurt and unnerved by the betrayal of both Arthur Sinclair and Lucy Bennet. Roland told his friends about the exchange. "Did you manage to speak to Lucy?" he asked. Edna moaned. "She wouldn't stop talking, but only about weddings and china patterns. Even Kate couldn't get a word in." "It doesn't matter. Miss Bennet has made it clear that she's going to stand with Arthur on this." "Why is he doing this, Rowley?" Edna asked. "You're his family." "I don't know. Years of feeling cheated, I guess. And he seems to genuinely believe Wilfrid killed Father, or at least he did when the shouting started. He knows Will has an alibi now." "What do you think, Rowley?" Clyde asked. "Could Arthur have killed Hayden?" Roland grimaced.
He makes a valid point. The body was cold when he found it. Hayden was probably killed the previous day or early that morning. He could have done it then, I suppose, but why would he then go back to the scene with Lucy no less? Perhaps he left something incriminating at Emo Ruo and went back to retrieve it. He could have done that on his own, without Lucy. Arthur paid Hayden to return, but I don't think he killed him. So we're back to no idea, Clyde said, groaning. Wilfrid came into the conservatory. He seemed weary. "How's Kate?" Roland asked, pulling his brother aside. "I might telephone her doctor. This kind of stress is not good for her with the baby due in less than a month."
"Is there anything we can do, Mr. Sinclair?" Edna asked. "Anything at all?"
"Thank you, Miss Higgins." He glanced at Ewan, who was sitting in Clyde's lap, chewing on a wooden block. "Perhaps if you take the boys up to visit with her, it might be a welcome distraction."
"Of course." Edna took Ewan from Clyde. "Where's Ernie?"
Chapter 33. Verses from Bairns. Bobby's Swing. Bobby King, he had a swing in an apple tree. All day long you heard this song, "Will someone please swing me?" When mother said, "Time for bed," Bobby used to cling, hands tight with all his might, to his treasured swing. But at last, all warnings past, father had his way, and Bobby King, he lost that swing through failing to obey. Cairns Post, 1932. "Ernie's in the garden with the nanny. They said something about a swing," Milton said, standing. "You take Ewan up, Ed, I'll go find him." "I'll give you a hand," Clyde said. "The swing is in the elm tree, if I recall." Roland poured his brother a drink. "Maurice Kent is of the firm opinion that Mother would be declared unfit to stand trial even if the Crown elected to prosecute," he said quietly, accepting the glass of whisky. "On the whole, he doesn't believe they'd have enough evidence. In fact, their case against you is at best extremely flimsy and would be completely unsustainable if it wasn't for the Hayden murder." "So what are they saying?" "If we could show that you couldn't have killed Hayden, then the indictment for Father's murder would more than likely also go away." "But I could have killed him, Will. I wasn't under lock and key that day after the fire, and while it's unlikely that I slipped out without anyone noticing, it's not impossible." "Which leaves us with finding the real murderer. You accused Arthur." "Yes, I did suspect it might have been him at one point, but I doubt it now. To be honest, I doubt he could have beaten Hayden to death." "What, physically?" "That too. But I doubt he was angry enough. I saw the body. Hayden had been battered. It wasn't just one punch. It must have been someone with a serious grudge. Like me, I suppose." "Very well," Wilfrid decided. "We'll look into who had reason to hate Hayden, other than you and me." Milton returned while they were discussing how to proceed. "Clyde's still looking," he said, "but there's no sign of them. Miss Walling and her crew don't seem to have seen them either. Mr. Waring wouldn't have taken Ernie on a picnic somewhere, would she?" Wilfrid sighed. "I wouldn't have thought she'd do so without notifying us, but I'm afraid she's the silliest young woman we've ever had look after the boys." He stood, pacing irritably. "If I hadn't served with her father—" "I'll go out and search with you," Roland volunteered. "They couldn't be too far. Is Lenin with them?" "Yes, I believe so." "That's how we'll locate them, then." Roland grabbed his hat. They headed into the garden, shouting for Lenin rather than Ernest or Nanny de Waring, in the hope that the dog's single ear might prove more keen by virtue of the fact that it was attached to a greyhound. It took only a few shouts to elicit a responding bark. Relieved, Roland followed the sound to the fence near the front of the property. Lenin barked madly as he approached. "Settle down, old boy." Roland untied his dog from the fence post. "What the dickens are you doing out here? And where are Ernie and Mr. Waring?" He called for Ernest a couple of times, succeeding only in startling a flock of cockatoos from the gums along the fence line. Lenin panted, squirming excitedly and jumping up upon his master. "Come on, we'd best get back," Roland said, worried now. What would the boy and his nanny have been doing so close to the road? He sprinted back to the house. "You found Lenin?" Milton said as Roland and the greyhound reached the house garden. "Where's
"I don't know," Roland replied, catching his breath. "Someone had tied Len to the house-yard fence. There's no sign of either Ernie or Mr. Waring." "Bloody hell!"
"Look, could you check again with the gardener?" Roland said grimly. "Someone must have seen them." Roland found his brother in his study. "Will, we have a problem." He told Wilfrid of their failure to find either Ernest or the nanny. Wilfrid paled, but he wasted no time. He phoned Harry Simpson and the other managers immediately, directing that every man on Oakley down tools and join the search. And then he telephoned the police.
"She's probably taken him on some ramble and gotten lost," Wilfrid said gruffly. "Let's not worry, Kate. We'll probably find them within the hour."
Roland said nothing. He hoped his brother was right. Oakley was vast. How far could a 6-year-old and his nanny possibly have walked by themselves?
"Perhaps one of them has been hurt. A snake."
Wilfrid stopped.
"Dear God."
Roland pressed his brother's shoulder. "Come on, Will. We'll join the search." Outside, Harry Simpson was already organising teams to scour the property in every direction. Roland spotted Jack Templeton. He looked white and shaken.
"She wouldn't have gone far, Mr. Sinclair," he said. "Mrs. Sinclair had given her the afternoon off. We were going to the flicks in Yes just as soon as I got through with planting the elm trees."
"When did you last see her, Templeton?"
"This morning. She was speaking to Mr. Sinclair."
"Will?"
"No, the other one."
Roland thanked him, already striding back to Wilfrid, who was standing over maps, barking orders and directing men. He told his brother what he'd ascertained from Templeton. "Where did Arthur and Lucy go from here, Will?"
"I don't know," Wilfrid said angrily. "Sydney, I presume, though they may have stopped in Yass for lunch."
He started towards the house, motioning for his brother to follow.
"Rowley, would you telephone the police again? See if they can find them?"
He paused as they stepped through the front door, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose.
"I'm going up to advise Kate," he said slowly. "All these people here, she'll sense something." He faltered. "Would you mind asking Miss Higgins to stay with Kate?"
Roland nodded, unnerved by his brother's fear. He had never seen Wilfrid afraid. Once he'd spoken to the police, Roland ran upstairs to find Edna. She was waiting outside Kate's bedroom with Ewan, while Wilfrid broke the news to his wife. Edna threw herself into Roland's arms. Ewan protested as he was squashed between them. "Sorry, mate," Roland said, taking his godson from the sculptress. He put one arm around Edna and told her more completely what was happening. She looked up at him in horror.
"Oh, Rowley, how could this happen?"
"I don't know, Ed. Oakley's an extensive property, and there are still a few uncleared patches and gullies. I wandered off when I was younger than Ernie. I'm told it took nearly 6 hours to find me."
"But Mr. Waring is with him."
"I hope she is. Perhaps he wandered off and she's looking for him." Roland watched vaguely as Ewan played with his tie-pin. "They can't have just vanished." Edna glanced at the closed door behind which Wilfrid was telling his wife that their eldest son was missing.
"Poor Kate. She's already so upset about Lucy."
The sculptress wiped her eyes and kissed Ewan's chubby hand.
"We'll have to look after your mummy, won't we, darling?"
"Thank you, Ed. You're a brick."
"Rowley, why don't you take Doris up over Oakley? You might see something from the air."
"That's a capital idea, Ed," he said. "Ernie can't see a plane without waving like a lunatic." Grateful to have something he could do, he smiled and kissed the sculptress on the forehead. Wilfrid cleared his throat as he stepped out of the bedroom. He looked haggard, desperate. Edna took Ewan from Roland. She paused at the door, placing her hand gently on Wilfrid's arm. He seemed startled.
"I'll stay with Kate, Mr. Sinclair."
"Yes, thank you, Miss Higgins. The doctor will be here shortly." Roland told Wilfrid of Edna's suggestion as they descended the stairs. Wilfrid checked his pocket watch. "We have a couple of hours before sunset. I'll go up with you. I can look while you fly the plane." Roland didn't argue, concluding that Wilfrid needed to do something practical as much as he did. Outside, Roland looked for Clyde, but it seemed he'd departed with a hastily recruited search party led by Harry Simpson. He spotted Jack Templeton, who had just returned from an unsuccessful search with Bob Bowman's group, and beckoned him over. "Look, Templeton, Will and I are going to take the plane up, see if we can spot them.
Would you give me a hand, pull away the chocks, that sort of thing?" "Of course, Mr. Sinclair, anything to help. I can't believe they've just vanished." The young gardener choked on his words. He looked wretched. "Thank you, Jack," Roland said. "We'll find them. We'll find them both." Roland parked the Mercedes outside the shed and opened the doors. Wilfrid and Templeton followed him in. He climbed onto the wing, rummaging in the cockpit for the second cap and goggles. "There's a pair of binoculars in the car. It might be a good idea to take them," he said, reaching into the passenger compartment. "Hey, we still need to get the plane out," he called, as he heard the doors swing shut, darkening the shed's interior. "Rolly!" Wilfrid's voice. Roland turned. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the diminished light inside the now closed shed. "Don't move, Roland. Not an inch." Templeton's voice, but different, angry, confident. The gardener had one hand on the back of Wilfrid's collar. The other held the revolver he pressed against Wilfrid's skull. "What the hell?" "Come down from there. Slowly now. 'Cause believe me, I'd be quite happy to shoot your bastard of a brother." "Come on, Jack, steady." Roland did as the gardener asked, his mind working frantically to understand what was going on. Templeton motioned him over to the caterpillar. "You'll find a rope on the seat. Give it to Mr. Sinclair here." Again Roland had no other choice but to do as he was told. Templeton pushed Wilfrid forward. "Now tie Roland to that post over there. Either one of you tries anything, and I'll shoot you both, I swear." "What do you want, Templeton?" Wilfrid asked as he bound Roland to the post. He tied the knots securely, but carefully ensured there was just a little give in the bonds. Templeton waited till he finished, and then, with the gun trained on Wilfrid, he stepped behind the post to test the knots. He noticed the slight slackness. The gardener didn't hesitate, stepping back suddenly and shooting Roland in the upper arm. The bullet chipped the post after tearing through Roland's flesh. Both Sinclairs swore, Roland in pain and Wilfrid in horror. Instinctively, Roland struggled against the rope. His arm was on fire, but he could still move his hand. Desperately, he tried to loosen the bonds while the chance existed. It did not exist for long enough. "Let's try again, Mr. Sinclair. If you don't tie him up properly this time, I'll be forced to immobilize him by other means." Templeton pointed the revolver at Roland's head. Having evidence that Templeton would carry out his threat, Wilfrid tightened the bonds. Roland cursed as his arm was pulled back. "I'm sorry, Rolly," Wilfrid said quietly. Then to Templeton, "He's bleeding, he needs a doctor." "No, he doesn't," Jack Templeton said firmly. "Now you." "I can't tie myself up, you idiot," Wilfrid said, taking out his handkerchief and clamping it against the bloody wound on Roland's arm. Removing his own tie, Wilfrid used it to bind the handkerchief in place. Templeton moved towards the caterpillar. "Before you decide to be heroic, Mr. Sinclair, you may wish to remember that your brother cannot run or duck, and I'm a pretty good shot." He kicked out a bag stashed behind the tractor, and without taking his eyes from Wilfrid or his gun from Roland, extracted a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around, Mr. Sinclair, and put your hands behind your back." Wilfrid didn't move. "I could just shoot out your kneecaps," Templeton said, aiming the gun accordingly. "Will," Roland said, "do what he wants." Slowly, Wilfrid turned and placed his hands behind him. Templeton pressed the muzzle of the gun on Wilfrid's neck and secured the handcuffs. With both Sinclairs now restrained, he seemed to relax slightly. He shoved Wilfrid back against the post to which Roland was tied and forced him onto his knees. "What do you want, Templeton?" Roland asked this time. The initial shock of pain was settling, and he was focusing again. "You don't remember me at all, do you, Roland?" Templeton stepped up to him. "Should I? I used to live here. Was born here, in fact. We even played together once or twice before your father forbade it." Roland said nothing. "Of course. Why would you remember me? I was one of the workers' kids, not good enough for you uppity Sinclairs to remember or even think about."
Roland stared at him, trying to force some sort of recognition. And then it came, more a guess than a realization. You're one of Charlie Hayden's boys. Chapter 34. Aid for Orphanages. Mr. E.A. McTiernan, Attorney General, speaking at Parramatta, said that £50,000 had been placed upon the estimates in order that a due payment might be made by the state for each child succoured by the orphanages throughout the state, whether by being made an inmate of some orphanage, like that at Balcombe Hills, or by being boarded out. If it was right that in the latter case the guardian of the child should be reimbursed by the state, it was equally right that the sisters of the orphanages should be reimbursed by the state on similar lines for the care of the orphans they rescued from unfavourable and dangerous conditions, and placed safely on the road to honourable manhood. Whilst this was done, it was trusted that the spring of private charity now flowing to the benefit of the orphanages would not dry up. The Sydney Morning Herald, 1922. The man who called himself Jack Templeton smiled. Yes, Charlie was me dear old dad. Roland winced. I didn't kill your father. I know. I finished the bastard myself. Both Roland and Wilfrid stared at him. Templeton seemed to relish their bewilderment, their attention. I just tracked Charlie to Queensland, drinking himself to death in Toowoomba, he said, when suddenly he takes off. The old soaks who drank with him reckoned he'd come into some money. Templeton sneered. I wasn't going to let the old mongrel get away from me, so I followed. Could have knocked me dead when I realised he'd come back to Yass, and then I heard Miss Walling was looking for some men to help with Lord Wilfrid's fancy gardens. He recognised you? Roland asked, remembering that Hayden had waited on the veranda for Kate with a full view of the gardens in which Edna Walling and her men were working. Oh, yes. Wanted me to help him extort a little something extra from you Sinclairs. When I refused, the drunken fool thought he might be able to persuade me with a thrashing. But I'm not a boy anymore. If you know we had nothing to do with your father's death, what the hell are you doing? Wilfrid demanded. My God, man, I don't have time for this. I have to find my son. My issue, Mr. Sinclair, is with you. What you did. Because I sacked your father? You did more than sack him, Mr. Sinclair. You destroyed him. You exiled him, and in the process you destroyed his family, my family. Templeton pushed the revolver muzzle up under Wilfrid's chin. My old man wasn't such a bad bloke until your bloody father instructed him to flog Roland here. Then Dad decided that if it was good enough for the Sinclairs, his own boys could probably benefit from having the living dickens belted out of them. But you never thought about that, did you? How the devil was he supposed to know? Roland said in his brother's defence. He didn't even know about what was happening to me. Yes, but once he found out, he sorted it, didn't he? Whichever one of you killed old Henry, life got much better for you after that, didn't it, Roland? But it got a hell of a lot worse for us. We lost everything. What did you expect me to do? Wilfrid said, meeting Templeton's eye. There are still scars on Rowley's back from what your father did that night. Did you really expect me to keep him on? No. I would have thanked you if you'd shot him along with your own father. But you didn't, did you? You punished all of us. We were destitute. My mother took her own life. My brother and I went to an orphanage. We didn't think life could get any worse, but it did. It did. And neither of you ever even wondered what had happened to Charlie Hayden's lads. Roland tried to reason with him. Look, Templeton, we didn't know. Perhaps we should have thought about you, but it was a hell of a time and we were doing the best we could. It was me who sacked your father, Wilfrid said. That was all me. It was nothing to do with Rowley or my son. Templeton laughed. What my father did was nothing to do with me either. But I paid for it. For God's sake, Templeton, he's a little boy, Roland pleaded. You don't deserve to be a father, Sinclair. Templeton spat at Wilfrid. In the end, you're the same man your father was. How many times have you belted that poor kid? Wilfrid pulled back, stunned by the thought. "Jack," Roland said, seeing hope in the accusation. Templeton was ironically trying to protect Ernest on some level. Will's never laid a hand on the boys, not to hurt them.
"How would you know?"
Templeton retorted.
"He claims not to have known what was happening to you. Maybe you're as oblivious as he was."
"What do you want, Templeton?" Wilfrid asked. His voice was strained, unsteady. "If it's money, I'll give you whatever you want. Name your price. Just, for God's sake, give me back my son."
"Can't do that. I'm not stupid, Mr. Sinclair. I know this isn't going to end well for me. Afraid it's not going to end well for you either."
He poked Wilfrid with the barrel of the revolver.
"I was just going to stick around and enjoy watching you grieve, like I grieved for my mother. Don't even know where they buried her. A pauper's grave somewhere, I expect. A stark contrast to the marble monument you erected for your father. I thought it would be fitting to watch you with no grave to mourn, but somehow I don't think taking your son will be enough. I'll have to shoot you."
"What have you done with Ernest?" Roland demanded as he watched his brother turn grey with grief and terror. "I know you haven't hurt him, Jack. You liked him. He liked you." Roland was speaking as much to Wilfrid as their captor.
"I did like him, but you're wrong."
Roland struggled against the urgency of his own anguish, stemming it with denial and a desperation to save his brother. Jack Templeton took aim at the back of Wilfrid's head. Wilfrid barely moved, defeated by the loss of his son. Roland shouted, straining against the rope, ignoring the physical pain as he threatened and begged.
"Stop, Jack, please. I can fly you out of here. Kate, Mrs. Sinclair's about to have a baby. For pity's sake, man."
Templeton turned on him.
"Shut up," he screamed. "Shut the hell up, I can't think."
"I can fly you to Queensland. You'll have such a head start they'll never find you. Just stop."
Templeton aimed at Wilfrid again, but he hesitated.
"What about your arm?" he said.
"I'm all right,"
Roland replied, seeing Templeton's resolve weaken.
"I can fly."
Templeton took a knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding Roland.
"Get the plane ready. Try anything and I'll kill your brother."
Pushing the gypsy moth out of the shed by himself proved to be a challenge. Roland didn't think he was badly wounded, but moving his arm was painful. He'd hoped that out of frustration or impatience, Templeton might be tempted to help, to let down his guard and point the gun away from Wilfrid. Instead, the gardener secured Wilfrid to the post, while Roland used the caterpillar to pull the plane out. Eventually the Rule Britannia was ready and waiting on the flat of the paddock outside, but still in view of the shed. Roland climbed up onto the fuselage to switch on the fuel lines. Templeton backed out of the shed and clambered into the second cockpit, the revolver now aimed directly at Roland.
"What are you doing?"
he demanded as Roland moved to jump off.
"I have to swing the propeller to start the engine, or we're not going anywhere. Remember that I've got the gun. Try anything, and I'll get out of the plane and shoot your brother."
"Yes, you've made that perfectly clear." From his elevated position on the fuselage, Roland had caught sight of the convoy in the distance. He dropped onto the ground before Templeton saw it too. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Wilfrid struggling against the ropes. Determined to keep Templeton in the biplane, he spun the propeller. Now Jack Templeton saw the vehicles hurtling down the farm lane to Emo Ruo.
"Get in," he shouted. "Get in and fly this bloody contraption."
Roland declined in terms that were profane and certain. He ducked, ready for the shot this time. A second shot splintered the propeller blade. He moved under the fuselage. The motorcars reached the gate. Templeton launched himself out of the cockpit and ran for the shed. Roland went after him, charging him to the ground just short of the doors. They grappled for the gun. Roland slammed Templeton's hand to the ground as the gardener pulled the trigger. Roland wasn't sure where that bullet went, nor the next. Pinning Templeton, he forced open the gardener's hand and disarmed him. And then he punched him, repeatedly. It was Clyde who pulled Roland off.
"What have you done with him, you bastard?"
Roland was desperate.
"What the hell have you done with Ernie?"
Templeton shook his head. Roland lunged for him again. Milton helped Clyde hold Roland back this time, and it took the both of them. Detective Gilby arrested Jack Templeton. Delaney uncuffed Wilfrid, but held him back, in an effort to ensure that he too did not attack the prisoner.
"Rowley, you're bleeding,"
Clyde said, noticing the wound. Roland staggered, a little light-headed now. Milton steadied him.
"How did you—"
Roland began.
"We found Mr. Waring, the nanny,"
Delaney replied.
"Thank God,"
Wilfrid said quietly.
"She and Ernest are unhurt?"
Delaney flinched.
"Ernest wasn't with her, Mr. Sinclair. We located Mr. Waring at the railway station waiting for Mr. Templeton. She said he was coming out to meet her as soon as he'd taken Ernest back to the house. They were planning to elope."
Nobody spoke as Wilfrid Sinclair approached Templeton. Nobody tried to stop him. "I understand, Templeton. I understand my part in all this. I swear I will do what I can for you. But for the love of God, man, tell me where my son is." Roland watched Templeton's face, first surprise, and then the return of suspicion. His eyes hardened.
"Drag the dams,"
he said. Chapter 35. Childbirth at Home. Possible hospital danger. Opinion of doctor. Is Dr. H.G. Dane, chairman of the British Medical Association Committee on the National Maternity Service Scheme, right in stating that women are safer in childbirth at their own homes than they are in maternity hospitals? Dr. Dane declares that the danger from puerperal fever is great in hospitals and that freedom from it in the home outweighs other disadvantages. The News, 1930. Silently, Maguire stitched and dressed the lesion in Roland's arm. Having passed cleanly through the flesh, the bullet at least had done no lasting damage. The rest of it was the worst kind of mess. Wilfrid sat behind the desk, staring at a glass of whiskey and smoking. Periodically he retrieved the watch from his pocket and checked the time, monitoring the hours since he'd last seen his son. Maguire finished with Roland, and pausing only to press Wilfrid's shoulder, left them alone. "He was lying, Will. I know he was lying," Roland said vehemently, pulling his blood-stained shirt back on. He slung the tie angrily around his neck. "Then where is Ernie?" Wilfrid's voice was brittle, ravaged with the enormity of his tragedy. "Every skerrick of the property's been systematically searched, every building, every shed, every flaming hollow log." "What about Bates?" "He and Templeton were friends. Perhaps the police have questioned him. Bates didn't know Templeton before they were both hired here. He doesn't know anything." Roland closed his eyes. This was unbearable. "There must be places we've not yet looked." "There are," Wilfrid replied. "The dams." "Will, no." Roland turned away. He could not bring himself to think of his nephew as gone. It was incomprehensible. Templeton liked him. He wouldn't have hurt him. "You say that because that's what you want to believe," Wilfrid lashed out. "You and your set see only what you wish to see. Good when it suits you, evil when it doesn't. Why the hell didn't you tell me Templeton was having an affair with Ernest's nanny?" Roland faltered. He was flogging himself for that already. "It didn't seem to be any of our business." "None of our business?" Wilfrid stood and came after his brother. "Since when is the immoral conduct of the woman I have entrusted with the care of my children not my business, Rowley?" He exploded, grabbing Roland by the collar. "If I'd known! But no, you decide that it's perfectly acceptable for my staff to engage in the kind of debauchery to which you and your communist ne'er-do-wells devote your miserable lives." "Will, I'm sorry." "You're always sorry. It's never your fault." Wilfrid seized Roland's arms, shaking him. "Bloody hell, Rowley! That bastard's murdered my son, and all you can offer is that he liked him?" Roland felt each of his brother's words more keenly than any blow. He knew that Wilfrid was near crazed with grief, but that did little to shield him. "I don't know that I can forgive you for this, Rowley." Wilfrid couldn't stop. "If you'd said something, we would have at least been wary." "I don't know that I'll ever forgive myself, Will. I'm sorry. I know that's worth nothing now. Oh, God, if I could change it." Wilfrid stopped, aware suddenly that his hand was wet. He looked down at his grip on Roland's arm. The stitches had broken. The wound had reopened. Blood now seeped anew through the gauze and fabric and Wilfrid's fingers. He stepped back, jarred, recognizing the damage in Roland's eyes and even in the blackness of his own sorrow, regretting that he'd inflicted it.
God, Rowley.
Wilfrid's voice broke now.
I don't know how I'm going to tell Kate.
In time, the Sinclair brothers emerged from Wilfrid's study together. They didn't speak. What resemblance they bore to each other was accentuated by a wretched grief, and yet they were both contained, rigid with the grim need to carry on. The sleeve of Roland's jacket was torn, but the bloodstains were less visible on the dark wool fabric and his tie was straight. Maguire had repaired the stitches on his arm without once asking how they'd come to be disturbed. Wilfrid started up the stairs to speak with his wife. Roland wandered into the drawing-room, unsure what to do. He extracted his notebook more out of habit than any idea of sketching. Folded in its pages, he found the drawing that Ernest had presented to him so solemnly. It was some while later that his friends found him there, staring at the picture, unable to move away from it. Edna simply curled up on the couch beside him. Absently, he put his arm around her. "How's Kate?" he asked.
She was holding up, terrified, but Wilfrid's with her now. She refuses to believe the worst.
Roland blanched, unsure whether he could say anything without swearing. He said nothing. Edna rested her head on his shoulder.
"We're so sorry, Rowley."
Her tears were hot and wet as they soaked through his shirt. He held on to her. It was easier to comfort Edna. Clyde and Milton sat opposite. Milton broke. "I'm sorry we pulled you off the scheming bastard, Rowley. We should have let you beat the useless life out of him. We should have helped."
"Milt,"
Clyde cautioned, unsure that Roland was ready to discuss the man who killed his nephew. But the poet saw the guilt in Roland's anguish. "He fooled us all, Rowley. He seemed like a good bloke. God, the mongrel even joined the search, knowing—" Roland looked sharply at the poet. "That's right. Templeton joined the search from the very beginning," he said slowly. Wilfrid's words came back. "Every part of the property has been systematically searched." "What part of Oakley did Templeton search?" Roland asked, straightening. "Did he go anywhere in particular?" Milton glanced at Clyde. "Not Oakley. Templeton headed out with one of the first groups to Imarua." "Damn it!" Roland closed the notebook. "Damn it! How could I—" He stood. "I'm a flaming idiot!"
"Rowley, what is it?"
Edna asked. "I think I know where he took Ernie." Roland cursed, furious that he had not seen it before. Of course Ernie wouldn't be found if Templeton made sure he was the one that searched there, if he reported back that there was nothing there. Clyde stood. "What do you—" "It doesn't matter. I'll get Wilfrid." "No." Roland grabbed his arm. "Will's barely hanging on. If I'm wrong—" "Let's go," Edna said, standing. "It's dark." For the second time that day, the yellow Mercedes pulled up outside the shed at Imarua. They took torches, for they would go on foot from there. Setting out across the paddock, they headed towards the creek in search of the folly which Roland had recommended to the young lovers in Oakley's kitchen. It was not difficult to find once you knew it was there. A crumbling concrete structure built to resemble a classical temple, it was a folly in more senses than one. Erected before the war when Jeffreys had been fascinated with ancient architecture, it became a symbol of the whimsical, self-indulgent expenditure that saw him lose everything in the end. The dark outline of the faux relic became visible as they reached the top of the gully in which it was hidden. Roland broke into a run. "Ernie! Ernest, can you hear me?" There was no response. Almost completely hidden among a thicket of willows, the building was much larger than it had seemed at first. Cement columns on a parapet and large stone blocks arranged to look like ruins. "Rowley, over here!" Clyde shone the beam of his torch on a new padlock which secured a wooden door to the only walled part of the folly. The blackberry which had started to engulf the building was disturbed here, recently moved. Roland banged on the door and called Ernest's name again. Still no reply.
"We'll force the door," he said. "You've just been stitched back together," Milton reminded him. "Clyde and I will do it." The padlock may have been new, but the latch itself was old and rusted. It gave way almost immediately, and the door moved in. Then came the blast, a boom that seemed to shake the walls of the folly. Clyde and Milton recoiled, dropping to the ground, and Roland turned to shield Edna. But the explosion seemed contained, confined within the building. Nobody came out. Roland moved first. "Ernie!" Milton grabbed him before he reached the door. "Rowley, stop! You don't know what else he's rigged up in there. Ernie could be hurt. Just be careful, Rowley. Go slowly." Roland nodded. "You chaps and Ed stand back." Gently, very gradually, he pushed open the door. Plaster showered down from the ceiling. Clyde handed him a torch. Roland played the beam of light around what was a windowless cabin. A shotgun lay smoking on the floor, the gardener's twine which had been used to rig it a tangled mess. The bullets had hit the wall above the door. Perhaps the Enfield had jerked up when it discharged. They all stepped in now, adding their torches to the search to find Ernest motionless on what seemed to be a sheepskin in the far corner. Roland reached him first and bent to lift the boy into his arms, terrified that his body would be cold and rigid. "He's breathing," he said, leaning back against the wall, suddenly weak. But his grip on Ernest was sure.
"Oh, Ernie."
Edna stroked the boy's head.
"Why won't he wake up? Oh, God, was he hurt when the gun went off?"
Milton swung his torch back to the shotgun and the place where the bullets had impacted. The damage seemed fairly contained to the door's side of the room. "Can you find an injury? Is he bleeding?" Edna checked the child quickly.
"No."
Clyde retrieved an enamelled tin cup from the floor and sniffed it. "Templeton must have given him something." "Probably laudanum," Roland said, remembering his mother's missing medication. Perhaps Templeton had asked Nanny de Waring to procure it for him somehow. Milton removed his jacket and placed it over Ernest as he lay in Roland's arms. Though the boy's eyes remained closed, he murmured and sighed. "Come on, mate," Roland said as he carried his nephew out. "There are some people at Oakley who desperately need to see you." Clyde raced the Mercedes back to Oakley, blasting the horn with Milton, singing the Internationale in full voice out of the window, so that by the time they pulled into the driveway, half the household had emerged to investigate the commotion. Roland handed Ernest to his father. There was a moment when Wilfrid simply stared at his brother and the band of grinning communists who had ensconced themselves in his home.
"Templeton must have given him a sedative of some sort, Mr. Sinclair,"
Edna said, beaming, unable to contain her joy.
"But he's already starting to stir."
"How?" Wilfrid began. "We'll explain later," Roland said. "Take him to Kate." The kitchen at Oakley had rarely been so festive. Roland and his friends had felt the need to celebrate Ernest's return, but aware that Oakley was not theirs, they had abandoned the more formal parts of the house for Mrs. Kendall's kitchen. There they celebrated with the servants of the grand house, toasting young Ernest and drinking heartily to his health. Milton brought down the gramophone and Wilfrid's record collection, and they danced to Crosby, Armstrong, and Duke Ellington. In time, the party spilled out onto the back lawn, and Edna Walling and her workers, and even Harry Simpson, joined the impromptu celebrations. Alice Kendall opened her pantry, feeding all comers. It was past midnight when Wilfrid came down to find his brother. He watched quietly for a while as Roland danced with Edna, and Milton led yet another toast to Ernest Aubrey Baird Sinclair, who he announced would one day be Prime Minister of the Workers' Republic of Australia. Roland was a little merry when Wilfrid approached them on the veranda, which had become a dance floor. "Good Lord, Will," he said, catching Edna around the waist as she came out of a twirl. "You're the last person I'd expect to cut in."
"I think it's you Mr. Sinclair wants, Rowley,"
Edna said, laughing. Roland's brow rose. "You can't dance with me, Will. I'm a man." Wilfrid rolled his eyes, but he smiled, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "I do beg your pardon, Miss Higgins, but I would like to speak to Rowley while he's just vaguely sober." Milton overheard from the tabletop from which he had been making toasts, and raised his glass yet again, declaring defiantly, "Fill all the glasses there, for why should every creature drink but I? Why, men of morals, tell me why?" "Cowley," Roland responded.
"Of course you may speak with Rowley, Mr. Sinclair,"
Edna said, removing Roland's hand from her waist.
"I hope we haven't disturbed you and Mrs. Sinclair. We were all just so happy that Ernest is home and safe."
Wilfrid nodded. "It's not at all inappropriate, Miss Higgins. If Mr. Isaacs has not already ransacked my cellar, please let him know that he's very welcome to do so." Wilfrid beckoned his brother to follow, pausing only to ask Mrs. Kendall to bring a pot of coffee to his study as soon as possible. It was in the hallway that Roland first heard the screams. Wilfrid only just grabbed him before he ran upstairs. "Will, that's Kate," he said. Clearly she was being attacked. "I know, Rowley," Wilfrid said calmly. "The baby's coming. It is a couple of weeks early, but with all that's happened—" Another blood-curdling scream. "For God's sake, Will, that can't be right," Roland said, glancing up to the staircase. "We can't just allow—" "Her doctor and the midwives are with her, Rowley. Don't worry. It's all well in hand." Roland blanched as Kate screamed again. "What the hell are they doing to her?" "I'm afraid this part of the business can be rather grim," Wilfrid said. "Let me assure you, Rowley, this is one occasion on which you cannot charge in to save the day." Roland clenched his hands in his hair, horrified. "God, Will, how do you stand it?" Wilfrid sighed. "Usually I drink, but right now I need you to sober up a little." He took Roland into his study, and when the pot of coffee arrived, poured him a cup. "How's your arm?" he asked. "It stopped hurting a couple of drinks ago," Roland replied, hoping the coffee wasn't going to reverse that particular effect. He told his brother where they had found Ernest and why he had thought to look there. Roland braced himself for Wilfrid's fury, but he was honest about his part in it. "I'm sorry, Will. I told Templeton about the folly to give him and Mr. Waring somewhere private to meet." Wilfrid blinked. "Look, Rowley," he said finally, "I'm not thrilled that you felt the need to assist in the corruption of a young woman, but perhaps if Templeton hadn't known about the folly, Ernie would in fact have ended up in the dam." He closed his eyes. The thought was still too recently real. "I intend to say this again when you are not compromised by drink, but thank you. If Ernie had woken before you got there, he may have tried the door himself. Thank you for not despairing as I had." Roland flinched as another agonized scream penetrated the door of Wilfrid's study. It was by far more sobering than the coffee. "How long does—" "Hard to say, but each of the boys took several hours. Good Lord, I think I might need another drink. Not yet. There are some people we need to talk to." "Now? Who?" "Arthur and Lucy are waiting for us in the drawing room." Chapter 36. Another prince in the British royal family. It is an interesting piece of news, especially to women. The arrival of a baby in any home, or should it be a private hospital, is an item of conversation among the women in the neighbourhood. They must see the infant. Of course, it is cute. All babies are cute, and so like its mother or father, even though it might not resemble either parent. This interest in other people's children is a feminine characteristic. Father celebrates the arrival of a baby in a different way. He invites his friends to the bar counter for a drink, the ceremony being known as wetting the baby's head. It is worthy of note that this enthusiasm on the part of father cools off as later children come to share his payroll and add to his anxieties. The News, 1935. Elizabeth Sinclair had been entertaining her nephew and his fiancée while they waited. Lucy looked distressed and quite frightened by the sounds of childbirth which intermittently reached the drawing-room. It was an awkward time to visit.
"Should I look in on Kate?"
Elizabeth asked as she stood to leave. The nurse, now her shadow, stood also.
No, Wilfrid was firm. The doctor has it all in hand. You should try to get some sleep, Mother.
I'm not sure I will be able to with the noise.
She reached up and stroked Roland's cheek warmly.
I remember when you were born, she said. Wilfrid burst in with a stick because he thought I was being murdered in my bed. How it made me laugh. He was always so protective.
She said good night and left them to it. I expect she was talking about Aubrey's birth, Roland murmured. He had not heard the story before. No, it was yours, Wilfrid said, frowning. It was Aubrey who charged in with the stick, though, not me. Arthur Sinclair began.
Look, Wilfrid, can I start by saying how distressed Lucy and I genuinely were when the police told us about Ernest being missing. We came straight back to see if we could help. Whatever's gone on between us, we are, very fond of the little Dickens.
The police questioned us like common criminals,
Lucy said tearfully.
I can't believe you thought for a moment that we would be involved in a kidnapping like that. I'm Ewan's godmother.
Templeton indicated he'd seen you talking to the nanny. At the time, we had no idea of his involvement,
Wilfrid said brusquely.
She congratulated us on our engagement,
Lucy said.
Said she was getting married too, and introduced us to Mr. Templeton. It was rather unusual to have servants be so familiar.
You spoke to Templeton?
He gave me an envelope, Arthur replied. Said it was something he found that belonged to me. I put it in my pocket for later. I assumed I'd dropped something in the garden.
What was it? Roland asked. Arthur hesitated.
To be honest, I only thought to look in it when we heard that Templeton was involved in Ernest's disappearance. It was the last payment I'd made to Hayden. I gave it to him the morning after the fire.
I see, Wilfrid said coldly. You are aware, I hope, that Hayden was Jack Templeton's father, and that Templeton killed him that day.
Yes, Arthur replied. Perhaps you're also aware that your duplicity, your headlong pursuit of what you consider your birthright, may have ended in a tragedy much greater than the death of my father.
Arthur glanced at Lucy. He took her hand.
A couple of days after I went back to Sydney, I received a message from a barrister I briefed occasionally when I was in practice in Melbourne. I had other things on my mind, so I didn't think to return the call until Lucy and I had come back to Yass and were waiting for news of Ernest. I telephoned him from the Royal. I believe you gentlemen both know him. Dag, that is, Robert Menzies.
Yes. Wilfrid's eyes narrowed shrewdly. I am acquainted with the man.
He told me he'd recently had a visit from my cousin.
Both Roland and Wilfrid stiffened, aware that this breach of bail could see Roland sent back to Long Bay until trial.
Bob told me what you'd discussed, Arthur continued. Whatever you may think of me now, Wilfrid, let me say that I acted on a conviction that you'd killed Uncle Henry.
I see.
And what Menzies told you has led you to doubt that conviction?
Wilfrid posed impassively.
He was with you when the gun was fired. I don't know how I could not doubt it. He also told me about his conversation with Aunt Libby that evening.
Did he? And what do you plan to do with this information? Arthur Sinclair paused.
I intend to withdraw any allegations I've made against you and Roland, both formally and informally. Now that Templeton has confessed to murdering his father, the case against Roland will fall apart anyway. There is nothing to be gained for anyone by pursuing this matter any further, and I believe we shall all have to be happy with calling Uncle Henry's murder an unsolvable mystery.
What do you want in return, Arthur? Wilfrid asked bluntly.
I presume there's too much water under the bridge for us ever to be friends again.
You presume correctly.
Then let us settle this like gentlemen at least. I'm getting married. I would like to be able to afford to do so.
Wilfrid glared at his cousin. Very well, he said in the end.
We have property in northern Queensland. Its value is equivalent to what you might have hoped to receive from your father's estate had he not disinherited you. I'll sign it over to you on the condition that you and Lucy go and never darken my doorstep again. Haven't you had enough of exiling people, Wilfrid? The offer is fair, Arthur. My son may have died as a result of the events you put into train. Those events were put into train long before I came upon the scene. What if we refuse? Then you will get nothing. I know things, Wilfrid. Indeed. May I remind you, Arthur, that your beloved fiancée tried to shoot my brother in a fit of pique and passion. You may recall I took her gun from her that night. Do not test me. I'm being more than fair. Roland watched the exchange uneasily. Wilfrid was almost emotionless as he negotiated with Arthur Sinclair. There was a ruthlessness about him, but it was tempered. The offer was fair. Arthur vacillated. Lucy cried. She appealed to Roland, first apologizing for shooting at him, then accusing him of jealousy, of exacting revenge by banishing them to the wilds of Queensland. Wilfrid would not be moved. In the end, Arthur accepted. The deal was struck, and Wilfrid escorted his cousin and Lucy Bennet to the door. He returned to the drawing-room to find Roland waiting. Both men winced as Kate screamed again. Wilfrid glanced anxiously behind him and left the door open. "I thought you might have gone back to your party," he said, clearly distracted. Roland shook his head. "We should talk about Mother, Will." "What about Mother?" "I think she should come and reside with me at Woodlands." "Absolutely not." Roland took a deep breath. He had fully expected his brother to resist. He was prepared to make his case. "Will, it's safer for everybody if Mother comes with me." "Safer? Good Lord, Rowley, Mother isn't a danger to anyone." "Let's make sure. You have 2 little boys, and soon there'll be a new baby. Mother has always made Kate nervous. Now that we know, let's just be sure." "You're not suggesting Mother would hurt Kate? That's—" "No, of course not. I just mean that the anxiety can't be good for either of them. Besides, I think Kate's entitled to be mistress of her own house. That'll always be difficult with Mother playing Empress Dowager here." Wilfrid sat down opposite his brother. "Rowley, Woodlands is not an appropriate residence for a lady." Roland smiled. "It'll be fine, Will. I'll make sure she's gone to bed before we do anything particularly debauched." "This is not a joke, Rowley." "Look, Will, let's just try it for a while. She can always come back if it doesn't work out." Kate screamed again. Roland could see the perspiration beading on Wilfrid's brow. This evening was his best chance of changing his brother's mind. "I'll have the south wing made ready for her and the nurses. She'll have her own part of the house. Privacy if she wants it. The people who live with me may be communists, but they are adults. They understand about Mother, and I don't keep any weapons in the house." Wilfrid reared. "Mother is not some crazed, gun-wielding lunatic." "I'm not saying that, Will. But we don't know what caused her to shoot Father. We can't ask her. We can't be sure what exactly happened, so let's be careful. You've got to allow me to do my bit." Wilfrid wavered. "You can't possibly think that I'd neglect or be unkind to our Mother?" Roland pressed. No, I don't think that." "Then let's try it. It's got to be preferable to a sanatorium." A particularly long and agonized cry. Wilfrid stood, pacing now. "Perhaps having Mother with you will help you settle down. Grow up a little. Finally take responsibility," he said gruffly. Roland shrugged. He didn't want to trick Wilfrid into relenting. "I'll still be me, Will. But Mother can call me Aubrey or whatever else she wishes. I believe coming back to Sydney might do her good. She can lunch at the Queen's Club, have a day at the races, visit the beach at Thirroul. I think being occupied might suit her." "I don't think you realise how difficult Mother can be, Rowley." "All the more reason she should come with me, I think. If it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out, but we should try." Wilfrid groaned. "Oh, I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. Perhaps I'm the one who should be committed." Roland watched amused as Edna held his new nephew.
She and Kate sat in one of the newly installed garden seats. The sculptress's face was set determinedly as she cradled the child stiffly in her arms. Milton nudged Roland, grinning. They both knew Edna was afraid of babies. She was fine with children, though she tended to treat them like cats, plying them with milk when in doubt. But babies terrified her. On that score, Roland could sympathize. Newborns were odd, fragile creatures, quite slippery if you weren't careful. Fortunately, nobody expected men to hold babies, so he had been spared the awkwardness of it all. Gilbert Ambrose Baird Sinclair had come into the world in the early hours of the morning after his brother had been feared dead. And so he arrived at a time when grief and joy had already visited his parents in close succession. Wilfrid Sinclair was as besotted with young Gilbert as he was with each of his sons. The child's head had been wetted with champagne, and the silver spoon placed firmly in his mouth. In the wake of recent events, Wilfrid had retained 2 new nannies, both middle-aged, hefty, severe-faced women who would be unlikely to elope with gardeners. They rarely allowed the children out of their sights, hovering, ready to pounce on any would-be abductor. Milton swore they were carrying pistols in their garters. Gilbert was 10 days old now. Clyde closed and secured the bonnet of the Mercedes, satisfied that everything was in order for the journey to Woodland's house. He and Milton were taking the motorcar, while Edna flew back with Roland in the Rule Britannia. Wilfrid insisted upon escorting Elizabeth Sinclair to Sydney himself a week hence, giving his brother time to prepare for her arrival. For her part, Elizabeth seemed quite pleased to be moving back to Woollahra with Aubrey. Wilfrid came out with Ernest and Ewan in tow. He and the boys would take Roland and Edna to Emo Ruo once Milton and Clyde were on their way. They all waited patiently as 20-month-old Ewan navigated the steps, refusing any sort of assistance. Then Wilfrid shook hands with the communists. He had always been polite, but there was, on this occasion, a restrained and cautious warmth to his farewell. Even so, he was unlikely to ever entirely approve of Roland's left-wing friends. Being a practical rather than effusive man, not given to expansive expressions of gratitude, he had instead commissioned Clyde Watson-Jones to produce a series of paintings depicting the gardens Edna Walling had created at Oakley. Wilfrid wanted a detailed record of the grounds as they matured, and of course his brother refused to paint trees. Edna, too, had been commissioned to create a bronze sculpture for the pond, with the stipulation that nakedness be avoided at all costs. For Milton, there was little Wilfrid could do, as the poet seemed to do so little, but Wilfrid Sinclair was a man with a long memory, and his debts were always settled in the end.
"Right-o, Rowley,"
Milton called as he opened the driver's side door.
"We'll leave you and Ed to heaven's ebon vault, studded with stars unutterably bright, through which the moon's unclouded grandeur rolls."
"You and Shelley can rest assured we'll be back in Sydney well before nightfall," Roland said, laughing. The poet waved, and Clyde pressed the horn as they set off. Young Ernest chased the Mercedes down the drive, and the nannies chased him. This ends CD 9. CD 10. Chapter 37. The Clark Art Exhibition. Notes on the artists. The following are additional notes on the artists represented at the exhibition of pictures in the possession of Mr. E. M. Clark, now being exhibited in Hobart. William Beckwith McInnes. William B. McInnes was born at Malvern in 1889. He began his art studies at the early age of 14 at the Melbourne Gallery, where he worked first under Fred McCubbin and afterwards under Bernard Hall. In 1912 he went to Europe and stayed for 2 years, during which time he devoted himself almost entirely to landscape. This was new ground for young McInnes, as hitherto he had been trained chiefly as a portrait painter. McInnes has a fine sense of colour and a keen eye for the essential in a landscape, and is extraordinarily dexterous in his handling. McInnes has had the distinction of winning the Archibald Prize for 3 consecutive years. He has had many commissions as a portrait painter and has painted several notable group pictures. The Mercury, 1926. Roland poured drinks from the pitcher of chilled punch that Mary Brown had left on the sideboard. He and his friends had spent a good part of the day painting the black walls of the dining room, using white pigment to inscribe dense, detailed figures and patterns. Milton had contributed borrowed verse along the line where the wall joined the skirting boards and cornices. The result was dramatic, somewhat Beardsley-esque, and quite breathtaking. The exercise had been a whim, begun in jest, but had quickly consumed them all. The residents of Woodlands House had never before applied their art together, blending their styles and ideas into a single, quite extraordinary piece upon the four walls of the room. While they'd worked, they had discussed the issue of Rosalina Martinelli and her determination to marry Clyde with what they all considered an unseemly haste. Strategies were postulated, debated, and eventually dismissed for one reason or another. Keeping Roland out of jail, it seemed, was less problematic than keeping Clyde out of wedlock. Eventually, they withdrew to Roland's studio with their drinks. Roland's paintings had been returned to the walls, and it once again looked familiar, if somewhat tidier than usual. Mary Brown brought in a platter of sandwiches and cakes, since the dining room could not be used for eating. She communicated her disapproval of the unusual redecoration through a series of world-weary sighs. Roland grinned. His housekeeper's disapprobation felt comfortingly normal after the past weeks. Despite Wilfrid's misgivings about the manner in which his brother ran Woodlands, Roland had directed that they should carry on as usual. He was certain that his mother, when she arrived, would simply get used to them, ignoring anything that did not match the world in her mind. She appeared not to notice, after all, that everybody else called him Roland, in her determination that he was Aubrey. It was only when the fantasy was directly challenged by him that she seemed to break down. His friends were unperturbed about the impending addition to the household. Indeed, Milton declared openly that his grandmother was madder than Roland's mother any day. "It's not just pistols you have to keep from my granny, mate," he confided. "We've been hiding the knives for years. Upper-class lunacy has nothing on the proletariat variety." "What's that?" Edna asked as Clyde lugged in a large flat box which had just been delivered to the door. The sculptress wore overalls and a shirt belonging to one or another of the gentlemen she lived with. Her hair was pulled back under a scarf, and yet the only indication that she'd been painting was the faint smear of white on cheek. Roland's unprotected suit was, on the other hand, completely splattered. Lenin, too, had, in solidarity with his master, collected several drips of white paint on his brindle coat.
"This," Milton said, gleefully cutting open the box, "is the portrait that Rowley and I had done at Central Police Station."
"You don't sit for portraits in a prison." Milton made space and sat the large framed photograph on the mantel, stepping back to admire it.
"You can't put that up here,"
Clyde exclaimed.
"Why not? It's an excellent photograph," Milton said. "Captures a certain camaraderie, a joie de vivre in the face of injustice."
"There's a height scale on the wall. It's a police mugshot." "I like it," Roland said, tilting his head to consider the image. "It's a very fitting memento." "Wilfrid won't like it. Will never looks too closely at what's on my walls. I think it frightens him." Edna sat cross-legged on the armchair with a sandwich. Henry Sinclair's portrait stared thunderously down from the wall. Now that she knew, she could make out William McInnes's signature.
"Rowley, do you keep that painting because it's a McInnes?"
she asked. Roland was a portrait painter after all. The quality of McInnes's work might well have overridden the subject of it. Roland glanced up from his notebook. He had been sketching the sculptress, but that was not unusual. "In a manner of speaking." He closed the notebook and stood to examine the oil painting. "I was about 12 when my father sat for McInnes. He came to the house. When father wasn't actually sitting, I'd watch McInnes work. It was my first experience of portraiture."
"So that's why you hang it here?"
Roland smiled. "It's also my first foray into painting."
"You painted this?"
Edna asked, surprised. Aside from the fact that the portrait was not the work of a child, Roland's style was different. "Of course not." He beckoned her over. Standing her before him, he put his hands on her shoulders to direct her gaze. "Do you see anything odd about that painting? A mistake, perhaps?" They all stared at the portrait. Clyde picked it first. "There's a highlight on his earlobe that doesn't belong," he said, pointing out the dot of titanium white paint. "It doesn't really fit with the direction of the light. After that day in the woolshed, when Father sacked John Barrett and— well, you know the story." "Yes," Edna said, leaning back against him. "I was forbidden to set foot outside the house. McInnes called me into the room he was using to show me the finished painting before anyone else. He felt sorry for me, I suppose." Roland frowned slightly. Then he left the room for some reason I can't recall. "And you painted that highlight to floor the portrait?" Edna asked, tentatively. "Actually, I painted pearl earrings and a tiara on his head." They turned to gape at him. Milton laughed first.
Bloody oath, Rowley. You had a death wish, but I'm so proud of you.
"What happened?"
Edna said fearfully. She did not want to hear again that Roland had been barbarically punished. "McInnes painted over it. My father never saw what I'd done," Roland replied. "But he left that point of white, so I'd always know there were earrings and a tiara under there. Sometimes that helped." Edna looked back at the painting, seeing it differently suddenly. It was more Roland than his father now, a symbol of a boy's defiance, a precursor to the man he'd become. She smiled, delighted.
"Does Wilfrid know?"
"No. Will believes I hang the painting here to taunt my father's image with naked women in his favourite armchair."
"Will you ever tell him the truth?"
"Good Lord, no."
"But with everything that's happened?"
"With everything that's happened," Roland said, laughing. "I'm rather looking forward to going back to not talking about things again." Epilogue. Jack Templeton revealed the whereabouts of Ernest Sinclair within 12 hours of his arrest. He had, as Roland suspected, always liked the boy and intended him no direct harm. Of course, Ernest had by that time already been rescued by his uncle and a band of communists. Templeton was duly charged with the murder of his father, Charles Hayden, and the kidnapping of Ernest Sinclair. On the charge of murder, the defence argued successfully for mitigation, and he was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter as well as that of kidnapping. The charges against Roland Sinclair were dropped. Elizabeth Sinclair sent out beautifully illuminated cards announcing her return to Sydney. 3 nurses moved with her and worked tirelessly in shifts to ensure she had around-the-clock care. While she was never again the toast of Sydney society, Elizabeth settled well at Woodlands, enjoying the idiosyncrasies of her son's social connections. She established a particular rapport with Milton Isaacs, whom she believed to be related somehow to Sir Isaac Isaacs, the then Governor-General. For his part, Milton did nothing to disillusion her. Once established, the grounds and parklands developed by Edna Walling at Oakley became a showpiece of garden design. The rose beds that Wilfrid Sinclair had planted for his new bride remained, an eccentricity of box-edged formality in the rambling country estate. The picture Ernest Sinclair drew for his uncle was duly framed and hung beside the Picasso at Woodlands House. It remained the pride of Roland's collection. The Sane Democracy League continued to pursue Roland Sinclair in an attempt to recruit him, his fortune and his connections to their cause. Roland continued to resist. On occasion, however, Milton Isaacs would attend one of their debates or information sessions for his own amusement. Colonel Eric Campbell unsuccessfully contested the 1935 state election in the seat of Lane Cove for the Centre Party. The party failed to win a single seat. After a plebiscite in August 1934, the dual role of Chancellor and leader of Germany was confirmed upon Adolf Hitler, with an overwhelming majority. Hitler formally became the dictator of Germany. Roland Sinclair joined the movement against war and fascism as a fellow traveller, quietly putting his resources behind bringing Egon Kish to Australia for the anti-war Congress of 1934. With his brother's blessing, Roland Sinclair invested in Hugh D. Mackintosh's milk bar venture, which, initially at least, made the fortunes Mackintosh predicted. The Honourable Robert Gordon Menzies, KC, made the move to federal politics, successfully contesting the seat of Kooyong in September 1934. By October, he'd been appointed the Minister for Industry and Attorney General in the Lyons government. As Attorney General, he played a significant part in the attempt to deny entry to Egon Kish, the communist journalist in exile from Germany, who arrived on Australian shores in November of that year. In that respect, he and Roland Sinclair found themselves opposed. In the absence of any reliable evidence, Henry Sinclair's murder remained unsolved, and amongst his sons, unmentioned. You've been listening to A Murder Unmentioned by Sulari Gentle, narrated by Rupert Degas, published by Wave Sound Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted Sulari Gentle 2017. This recording is copyrighted 2017 W.F. Howes Limited.